So we were given 50 sheep a day. So operating 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year. I assumed Sagansar week off and a week of maintenance at some points. We did a mix of 40 sheep a day and 2 cattle. So that'd be 200 a week, 10 a week, 10,000 a year, 500 a year. At a carcass weight of 20 and a carcass weight of 200, you'd have 200 metric tons of mutton and 100 metric tons of beef at 100% capacity. 100% capacity being that 40 sheep and 2 cattle a day. If you're running at 80% capacity, it'd be 32 and 1.6. So that's the scale. So roughly speaking, producing 1 ton of meat a day. In terms of the revenue then, if you were selling mutton at 9,000 M&T per kilogram for the 200,000 kilograms, 1.8 billion there. Beef at 12,000 M&T per kilogram, 100 tons a year. There you go. In this, we don't have any byproducts in the model, which is for the whole meat sector in Mongolia an issue. Okay? So about 3 billion revenues per year. And then on the expenses, live animal costs, sheep in at 150,000 per head, 10,000 per year, that's 1.5 billion, and 2 million for cattle, 500, there's another billion. You got 2.5 billion there. At this plant, to run at capacity, you would need 3 to 5 butchers working. And so I ran it at 5 at the top. And technically, you're supposed to have a vet on site that you hire yourself. So that's an additional cost. And then you've got to market that meat and drive it around. So you need a driver. And I put in an accountant, bookkeeper, and a manager. So annual staff costs per year of about 103 million. Total costs of the livestock and labor running about 2.6 billion. So your gross margin after that, about 396, 97 million, about 400 million. Then operating costs. These are mostly estimates, but you've got to look at the power, materials, waste disposal, others, some marketing costs, especially, and then sales delivery. If you're driving that truck 100 kilometers a day to deliver a ton of meat, 200 days a year at current prices and typical fuel efficiency, probably about 30 million there. Then for your food safety, if you're trying to run a recognized food safety program, you have to have regular training that has to be done by external people. So that training cost for your food safety standards would be another chunk to do. So an estimate there, where did I put that? Where did I put my total? Subtotal there. And your total gross margin, taking that off from the gross margin, I'm sorry, 271 million left. I have to clean up some labels. I apologize for that. And then you've got some administrative costs, interest on your debt. This one, I'm assuming that you got a 3% small enterprise loan for this, but financed 75% of it. And then depreciation of 5% on a 20-year lifespan. Total fixed costs, almost 200 million. Total costs, about 2.9 million. And your profit before tax, about 83 million, and tax, and your profit afterwards, about 74. Actually, then, return after tax turns out in that to be about 14%, which was comparable to an UNCTAD study on the meat sector that put that return on investment in there. But after, so that's after tax, but before debt repayment. If you had that financed over 10 years, your remainder after debt would be 35 million. So that's at the 100% capacity and 3% interest rate. Profit after tax there and after debt repayment is there. At commercial rates, it's really hard to run. And if you drop down to 75% capacity, you start to drop into the negative range as well. So you really need, that soft financing and running close to capacity. But here's some of the issues. So, of course, interest rate and repayment terms. The seasonality of the livestock slaughter is going to hit your capacity, right? Most slaughter plants are running at such low capacity. To really make that flow, you need to keep it up high. And I think there's only one plant in Mongolia that runs at 80% capacity, I read. So this is an important one, and that supply of livestock is important. This doesn't have the byproduct markets in it, which is really typical for the meat sector here. But in other countries, that's a really important part of the revenue stream to make plants profitable in North America. So this is an area that needs to be developed and is starting to develop in some places, but that's a really important aspect of it. And this assumes kind of typical prices. So this would be a small plant selling into, say, Choibalson and competing in the regular meat market. So there's no premium price in here, and there's no price differentiation by improved different cuts. So that would have an impact on the revenue stream as well. So these two things really would be really important to securing the plant profitability. So your market, your utilization, and being able to get maximum revenue from every part of the product, including each different cut of meat and the sale of byproducts, instead of having to deal with them as waste. One of the issues for this plant will be scale. And it's relatively small. And so that scale is a challenge in a sense that if you want to get into the premium market, will you have enough product to pay for the extra marketing costs that goes along with it? So being able to have secured a premium market with a good partner that can give you kind of a long-term outlet for your product without you having to do all of the marketing development and all of those costs would help to make this work. Because a small plant, of course, it has only a ton a day to sell. You can't have huge marketing program on top of that, or it will consume it'll consume too much of the revenue. So you need a premium market, but you need to do it at a really efficient cost. So these were some of the summary of the business models. Looking at that end market, trying to get into higher valued markets, to get that premium price, but that takes time. In short term, it might have to be focused on local markets and maybe even selling directly to some of the food processors that need carcasses. But short to medium term, being able to develop those high valued markets, if you can secure them right from the beginning and produce that product, that's wonderful. But you have to make sure that your herders and producers are along with you, providing the raw animal, the live animal that's going to meet those quality specifications. So this really comes into the ownership of this plant by a private individual who is committed and has the experience and the networks and the money is really important. And if that's in place, then everything starts to flow, can start to flow. The feedlots, what's emerging is that most of them that are coming up in Mongolia are with companies that already have a market outlet. And what they're doing is securing their supply chain backwards by adding the feedlot and adding the grain production for that. It's a lot of capital and a lot of different marketing and production and breeding and feeding elements to it. So just in terms of most likely it's going to also develop with people that have that capital to be able to do so. Not so much herders themselves. Some might, if they happen to have enough feedstuffs handy. And I'll share an example from the farm I grew up on, which would be relevant in some parts of Mongolia. So I grew up on a farm in Western Canada, and we had about 400 hectares of land. We were primarily producers, but every farm always has some land that you can't crop. So you've got land that is pasture, and in the wintertime, you always have crop residue on, crop land that you can graze. So for our size of land, we had about 45 hectares that was pasture. And then we had all of this other cropland. We had some hay land as well. So we always had, this is a basic reality. My dad didn't want to bother with trying to handle 2 bulls because 1 bull is simple enough to manage. 2 bulls, now you've got issues in terms of bullfighting and keeping them apart. And we had enough land for 1 bull and enough cows to go with that bull. And that actually fit quite well on what we had for resources. So we grew wheat, barley, oats, sometimes mustard or canola. We had alfalfa hay. With the oats, we used it both as grain and baled it as green feed. And we had 30 or 35 cows. So we had 34, 35 calves every year. And we had our own feedlot, just small. But for our farm, it was completely circular, right? We were primarily wheat producers, but we always had feed grains and we always had low quality grains, and we always had food, crop residues, and we had pasture, and we could manage that herd. And then my dad would put the calves in our own feedlot, small, 35 head, use our own feed them through the winter, gave them something to do over the winter, and then we sold into that finished livestock price to the slaughterhouses in the spring and kept that value added for our own calves and our own grain. In some parts of Mongolia, that would be a very workable model, but not in all places. So in the most part, those big feedlots are going to come from people with big capital and markets already, with some herders, some places doing their own small ones. And then feeding on pasture and the feeder calves, backgrounding, this is all really possible to be done by herders and herder groups, with lots of opportunity for that to develop into co-ops that are tied to pasture management groups and developing direct commercial business relationships with the feedlots and the slaughterhouses. So that's how it would drive. And for this small community-based slaughterhouse, getting the private ownership and the vision and the management skills here and the links with the feedlot, either their own or with a feedlot in the area, because there are big grain farms in the area that could do that, could have these relationships back to the herder groups. And then it could really drive that change in the stocking ratios and the pasture management and the greenhouse gas reductions. That's the summary. Questions, comments, improvements?
Let's go. Again, good morning, everyone. Like yesterday, I'm very bad with microphone. I try my best. My name is Majidi Rabani. For those who were not here yesterday, I work with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, University of Alberta. A little bit about myself. Was born in 1975 in Iran. Did my bachelor and master in rangeland ecology and management in Iran. Left Iran in 2003. Never went back. Did my PhD in Switzerland on basically grazing land ecology. And I did 2 postdocs in Switzerland on methane emission from wetlands and also on plant growth and grazing impact on secondary component and how it impacts the plant productivity. Then moved to Canada, became Canadian citizen, working with my institute since 2014. As an applied ecologist, I work on diversity of different projects. One area that I work is basically on carbon and biodiversity, but mostly related to agriculture and livestock. So that's a little bit history about me. I work with the ABMI. This is the largest monitoring program in North America, the only one in Canada, and probably the largest one in the world, or one of the largest one. This is the province of Alberta, almost 600,000 square kilometer, maybe 1/3 of Mongolia. I can't remember exactly the number for Mongolia. We have almost 2,000 locations across the province. Since 2007, we are monitoring these locations using 115 different monitoring protocols, basically. And those monitoring protocols are related to biodiversity, habitats, ecosystems, and we have a very detailed geospatial monitoring program as well. We do monitor land. Every human footprint is mapped. Every change in the landscape we do. The level of the detail that we have is unique in Canada and North America, basically. What we do, data collection, sampling process. We sample every year at least about 50 to 60,000 samples from different species. And then we do verifications and data analysis and reporting and communications. I mostly work with the last two, of course. We have a big money program there. Okay. So about me, about the presentation today, thanks for coming. Try to make it shorter. This morning, we try to just explain some of the general background about the greenhouse gas emission and carbon sequestration. In the afternoon, we go a little bit deeper into how to measure that, how to do that, and how we can do that in Mongolia, basically. So this is basically based on the limited time that I had with this project, but I thought that maybe the general introduction would be very helpful. So first thing that I wanted to show you is that if you are not aware of that, I got this table from the recent report, Are Livestock Always Bad for the Planet? And these are really probably the literature that if you work in livestock sector, you want to be aware of. And there are interesting stuff like that one, Graze and Confuse. I like it very much. So definitely, if you want to get a view that how the world is thinking about livestock in terms of greenhouse gas emission, in terms of climate change, in terms of the environmental impact, and how that fits into the Mongolian traditional herding system, these are good resources that you can definitely take a look. They're all online, I guess, except one or two. If you need, let me know. I think you have all my email address. I hope so. But before I start about talking about that, I wanted to put these 10 claims about livestock and climate change on the screen, basically. And I think this is really important for everyone in Mongolia and everyone in a country like Mongolia to see this and learn about what is happening in the world in terms of livestock and climate change. Okay, a lot of people maybe start to complain, oh yeah, he's the meat guy. He's not a plant-based guy. I have a 19-year-old son that has a lifetime health issue and he stopped eating red meat 2 years ago and he can't take any red meat anymore, basically. But even with that, I want to stay with the reality. What is the reality? I'm not going to say that plant-based is better or meat base is better. That's not the subject for today. But this is the discussion that is happening. And if you go through this list, basically, you can easily see that there are some statements that are not working for Mongolia at all. Like, for example, animal and feed production contributes significantly to deforestation and land use change. That's not happening really in Mongolia. That's not the case in Mongolia. And you see a lot of other I can talk about Good, sorry. Okay, can I go without this? I can speak loud. Okay, good. Okay, so, and the second claim that I put here, pastoral livestock systems are associated with higher GHG emission due to low productivity efficiency and higher methane emission from low quality diet. Okay, true statement. But this is a one-sided story, basically. Like, we have greenhouse gas emission from livestock, but we also keep grazing land that sequesters a lot of carbon, that keeps biodiversity, that it's not agriculture. And agriculture itself, based on our studies in Alberta, can reduce up to 80% of biodiversity, basically, easily. And that's based on 500 site locations over 15 years monitoring, basically. There is no question about that. So you see, there are statements here. So Mongolia has to really start to think about the media and taking this to the media and talk about the opportunity in Mongolia, basically. The media is dominated with all of this stuff. If something is wrong, I leave it to you to judge. But if something is wrong, this is your duty. This is for the next generation, for now and for future, to start to talk about this. The main problem in the livestock world and all the discussion around climate change is that we don't have a good understanding of livestock production systems. The cows in Kansas are different than the cows in Mongolia. So that's a fact. It's not about the cows.
Long press.
Yeah, works. Sorry. Two things in my life is always complicated. First is microphone. The second one is when I'm with suit and tie. I can't really walk and I can't talk. Okay, so that works now. So this is really important. And in continuation with this one, I hope it comes. This is a false statement again. In a lot of reports, including IPCC, you see they compare industry by please. Okay. A lot of times you see that we compare this with the transport system, basically. We always say that transport has 14% emission, the contribution, and livestock has also 14%. But the reality is that for transportation, we only take this part. We don't go through a life cycle analysis. That we need fuel, we need building, we need a lot of different things, and we need to recycle. If we count that, this portion would be much higher than 14%. But for livestock, we know because we eat and because this is our main commodity, good for us. We go through the whole livestock supply chain, and then we count for every single effect, and then we come to 14%. So that was recently changed a little bit even in the IPCC model. They started to say that, oh yeah, maybe livestock are problem, but also part of the solution. And that's a good advancement. But what it makes us nervous is that basically this can stop development in livestock sector as well, because this is a misallegation anyway. And the media are using these kind of things because they say, oh, basically cows and transportation are the same, which is not correct. We have duty as consumer to basically choose the best food and bring down our footprints. And as an industry, we also have to do that. There is no question about that. But we have to be aware that, are we comparing apple to apple? That's the main thing. Now, if we go to the livestock sector, basically, we talk about the food chain. Basic stuff from my global ecology course, basically here. When we talk about livestock farming, this is what we talk about. When we talk about the supply chain, this is the whole story that we talk about. Our subject today is livestock farming, basically. The research shows that the greenhouse gas emission from that sector currently, based on the direct greenhouse gas emission, is equal to the direct greenhouse gas emission from the rest. Whether this is true or not, there is a lot of assumption, there is a lot of uncertainty, and regionally and spatially and temporally can be different. But what is important in life cycle is that we have what we call it a system boundary. And the system boundary can be cradle to farm gate, from where the cows were born to where they're sent to the slaughterhouse, or it can be the post-process, from farm gate to retail. Definitely, again, we want to talk about this. But the other important aspect is that what we call as a livestock product in greenhouse gas emission. So a lot of time we just talk about meat. But if you send an animal to slaughterhouse and count your livestock greenhouse gas emission per kilogram of live weight, you are giving all the greenhouse gas emission to meat. But there are a lot of other aspects, byproducts and products also from animal, including the fiber, that were produced at the same time that meat was produced. So system boundary and the separation of the GHG effect from different animal product is basically a challenge, and it's where the complexity come into life cycle analysis. So the cows and all the ruminant basically hold a lot of biodiversity, and the biodiversity comes through the microbe that they hold. A lot of people have had this is great. And we know as a human that microbiome and protection of the microbiome should be the key for us. Like my son has a problem now because the microbiome is not in balance. And so this is a good thing. They take the lowest quality food that the human can take. They have wonderful microbiome here, and they produce meat and other products. But this has consequences, and the consequences is methane, basically, methane production. And so if you look at that graph over there, excuse me, I forgot to put the reference. I have reference usually for my slides. I will add that when I send you the slides. But as you can see over there, basically, for most of the animals, methane is the most important one, except for pigs and for chicken, which is different. And that's because they are not prominent. But it's really dominant. This is along with like what we get from as respiration, carbon dioxide, and also what we get mostly from animal waste, which is not nitrous oxide. Now, these are the three main greenhouse gas emissions that we have, but we have to turn them to an equivalent and to a value or to a unit that is comparable, that we can basically compare them. And that's why they use the lifetime of the other two gases, like methane and nitrous oxide, and then they convert it to what we call it CO2 equivalent. So basically, CO2 equivalent is the measure, is the metric, is the unit that we use in greenhouse gas emission assessment. So, of course, there's a lot of discussion about methane. I will explain later about that. But these are basically global warming potential that we get from different greenhouse gases. Okay. Now, If you go back to the livestock sector, go back to the life cycle analysis, as you can see here, we have different areas for different impact or greenhouse gas emission impact along the life cycle. And as you can see here, well, this is probably Mongolia. Most of it is coming from here. We don't have much of the land use change here, fertilization use, and what you can see in this side. Of course, we have transportation and some sort of agricultural activity, but not much in Mongolia. Manure storage so far has not been really a problem unless you really have a feedlot. Otherwise, it's not a big problem. Processing and transportation, we don't talk about that today. But this part is the part that we really want to manage. And that's the part that you can see we have red. In red, we have direct sources. And in basically the other part, we have indirect sources that mainly coming from haymaking or production, supplementary food, feed and fodder, or it comes from like using agricultural input like fertilizer and so on. And that's mostly in the industrialized country that we have this. So if you want to do something with greenhouse gas emission, this is for us. This is for us to learn that where we want to mitigate greenhouse gas emission in livestock sector in Mongolia. Now, again, quickly background. We talk a lot about Mongolia and land degradation and so on. And we know that the optimal vegetation composition is always important. That is part of the rangeland health, pasture health, and we try to have the best health for our rangeland. And if we do, then what we do, we increase daily intake by additional forage, and we increase diet quality. And as a consequence, we decrease CH4 or methane emission. This is very simple, basically. But we have overgrazing, and the overgrazing and land degradation resulted in vegetation shift, and the vegetation composition change. My friend Lagwa always says green gobi for a doornut area, which when you walk through that area, yes, absolutely, it's green. But any green is not healthy, basically. So there are not much permanent, and we'll talk about this quickly. So vegetation change will change the forage quality and availability, and that has consequences for greenhouse gas emission. So yesterday when I was talking about climate change, I said other environmental issues, and this is how environmental issues are linked to climate change. Most of the time, it's not just about the amount of methane in the atmosphere. It's also about degradation of the land, and that's what we talk about: soil, climate, vegetation feedback. If we destroy that positive feedbacks, then of course we intensify greenhouse gas emission. We intensify climate change impact. So now, but Mongolia is in the time to move slowly to a different, maybe sort of livestock sector. And that's basically where it comes to, okay, let's say we keep animals too long on the pasture. Those are grass-fed, which is great. They're rich, very good. But people nowadays, they like maybe more like the feedlot productions and much nicer steak and so on. So we are now thinking about pasture-raised livestock and feedlot-raised livestock. And there's always people, they talk that grass forage and hay ingestion produce more methane, which is true because it's lower quality. If the rangeland condition is good and we have healthy plants and we have good species composition, might not be true. But because most of the rangelands are overgrazed and degraded, then that's a true story about Mongolia. But the other side, they say that if you use high quality feed, the ingestion of high quality feed in the feedlot will emit less methane, which is again true. There is a lot of literature that's showing that when you raise an animal in the feedlot, direct methane emission is much lower. So it can be 30%, 50%, depends on the conditions and so on. But now we are at the stage that we know that the livestock in Mongolia raised on pasture year-round, and it's mainly grass-fed and grass-finished. So that's the line, basically. Always on pasture, and always basically grass fed, grass finished. But we are thinking about other routes as well, because the reason is that we want to remove some of the livestock from the landscape. The reason is that we want to have a different type of meat product from our pasture. So if we do that, if we want to do that, then we come to the question that, okay, where we can mitigate greenhouse gas emission and where we can increase greenhouse gas emission. And that's a very good picture. That was one of the UN or I can't remember. I put the reference somewhere basically. This is a very good illustration that shows, well, a lot of people, they say, go back to the wild, remove all the livestock, go with land sparing. So, but there are also scientists that they say, well, bisons were great emitters, and livestock are great emitters, basically. They were also emitting, so they also emit greenhouse gas emissions. Nowadays, if we go with this one, just for protection, we use a little fossil fuel. But that's not really, that's maybe a protected area. But in reality, we are working about the extensive versus intensive farming systems. And in extensive farming system that we have in Mongolia, which is the traditional farming, we of course produce a lot of greenhouse gas emission. But and the fossil fuel use is very low, basically. We don't have. But if we go to the intensive farming, then this would be in the other way around, basically. And we increase the fossil fuel use and less greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a trade-off here. Now, how we can manage that, basically, we need to think about a fair comparison again. We need to think about this from the standpoint of carbon footprint, basically, carbon footprint standpoint. And that's where we can really do a comparison. It's not just about emission source in traditional way or extensive production systems, also the emission sink or carbon sink. We have carbon sequestration. And we know that when animals start to graze on low quality food or on grasses, we have microbes, they do a great job. And then due to this process, we have methane emission, and methane goes and warm up the air. And then eventually methane will be decomposed into CO2, and then will come back to photosynthesis to the cycle again. And then we have interaction between animal and soil and vegetation, and we have soil carbon input and output. But here what is basically important is that, okay, we understand about the carbon sequestration part. A lot of LCA analysis, they don't care about that part much. They care about what is going out, basically. But the other aspect is about the methane, that we put 25 times higher impact from methane over 100 years lifetime. But recent study shows that that might be overestimation and exaggeration in terms of the methane emission from extensive livestock production system, because the lifetime is shorter, basically, and it can convert it to CO2. So because of that, basically, all this stuff, you see in the news that things come up, and I would like to ask you not to put this on basically and say this is the solution and this is just a demonstration. And I explain you the story about this figure. About 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, someone shared with me a LinkedIn post, and that was basically this calculation here. And then when I looked at it, I said, well, that's perfect. That shows the reality. But then over 2 or 3 days, there were hundreds of negative comments that, oh, this is when the oil and gas industry wants to advertise about the green oil and gas production and so on. And so there was a lot of discussion around that, whether this is true or not. But in general, basically, this is what is happening in Mongolia right now. I mean, that we have limited outputs, for sure, in terms of direct emission, but we do have potential or capacity to increase carbon sequestration. This is a 150 acre, which is about 80 hectares basically. And the calculation shows that with 80 hectares, you have 388 tons of carbon every year sequestered, basically. Yeah, that's okay. That's acceptable. But if the rangelands are healthy, the part that needs attention in Mongolia is to restore and protect the greenhouse gas emission capacity in Mongolia. And that's all the degradation, overgrazing, controlling grazing, and so on. So this shows that livestock are both problems and solutions. Depends in which system you are. It also shows that we can have livestock sector, sustainable livestock sector, and we can have food security, and we can have all of those. It's back. Okay. But we need to understand the diversity of livestock system. We need to understand Mongolia is different than Kansas, and industrial world. We need to understand that carbon sequestration is a big part of this. And unfortunately, in most of the life cycle analysis now, carbon sequestration part, when you do greenhouse gas emission assessment, is the simplest part. And a system like traditional system Mongolia does not really fit into that life cycle analysis, basically. It's a feedlot and it's a farm, and you put crop and then you calculate greenhouse gas emission, and then the animals are in the feedlot, they have manure and so on. But when you really want to do something for a simple herder in Mongolia, then that's not the way that the life cycle analysis so far has developed. So, and the other question is that a lot of people, they talk about putting trees in the pasture and putting trees in grasslands. And there's a UN report recently came out, it's COP27, and there was a session that they discussed whether this is a good idea or not. The point is that in rangeland, basically, if we have a healthy rangeland, we have a diversity of native species. If it's degraded, we have annual species, as Lago always mentioned, Bringabi, basically, in many cases. Okay, and you can see here what is happening here. I don't want to talk about the bacterial communities here and what is happening. But one source that we pump carbon into the grassland system, into the soil, is from the roots. The roots of pumping carbon to the soil and to the microbe, basically. Look at these root system and look at the diversity of root system, that how they can survive and be resilient with climate change and with climate variability. This is how a grassland is developed over centuries, basically. This could be a farm, or this could be an invasive species. This is exaggerations, but this shows the root depths, basically, and root volume, and compared to a wheat farm. So it's really important to understand that in the grassland system, you are protecting the carbon because it's underground. It's not fire. If fire happens, it's safe. If you put trees, some people may say, oh yeah, we get deeper root and so on, but how many years it take, and then how they can survive with the harsh condition like soot, I am not sure, basically. So I'm not against trees. I love trees. And I always try to have at least plant 3-4 trees every year. Culturally, I love that, basically. And I do that because my father did many years, and I want to do the same. But we need to understand that what is the capacity and what system we are looking for. So we have a huge capacity here with the rangeland, and we can basically restore that. If we convert that, we lose 30 to 50% of carbon storage, sometimes 60%, sometimes 70%, depends on whether we do regenerative cropping practices or whether we just do maximum tillage and so on. But we lose a lot of this. So we need to protect that opportunity, and that's exactly what we call it, greenhouse gas emission capacity, mitigation capacity from rangeland. Okay, now there is a lot of number coming out, and we talk about that this afternoon, about greenhouse gas emission intensity. So usually when we talk about greenhouse gas emission, we change it to CO2 equivalent, as we discussed. But one thing that is important is that when we talk, we can have per head per year, or we can have per kilogram of product. Here is per kilogram of product. This came out from New Zealand, basically. They recently released a report. They are so proud of their pasture-based and pasture-raised beef and lamb production, basically. And they talk about that it's not just about direct emission, it's also about carbon sequestration. And the amount of the carbon that we sequester, they sequester in their pasture system can put them into close to, when they talk about the net GHG emission, they say it's a zero, almost zero. Sometimes it depends on some, or a little bit negative, or sometimes it can be even positive, definitely. So that's a sustainable system. And they have this argument to show that, okay, livestock farming works. Like in Mongolia, it can work. Like in terms of greenhouse gas emission, like in Africa, it can work. And it's different than intensive production system. They compared here, I talk about this number later, but they compare about 23 kilogram per CO2 per kilogram of product for sheep and 31 for cow. These are the maximum, basically. In Mongolia, it might be higher now because animals spend more energy and searching for food and other stuff that we talked this afternoon. So Mongolia can put it something like this in future, and they can bring a lot of consumers. A lot of consumers are after grass-fed meat, basically. They can come after this product, and that's a great opportunity. So a few slides. I don't know how much time I have. 10 minutes? 18, okay, yeah, I tried to keep it short that we answer the questions. So now, with all of this background that I gave to you very quickly, I just want to emphasize on two things that we can do, because we said this is a policy session. One thing would be at the animal level, and the other would be at the pasture level, management level. I am not an animal expert, basically, but at the animal level, we heard yesterday and about herd restructuring and discussions and so on. And we heard a lot about animal health, productivity improvement, feed efficiency, and so on, selecting the best breeds in our herd, basically. And these are the things that really needs to be done in Mongolia in terms of increasing livestock productivity. The reason that right now they say greenhouse gas emission rate for livestock production in Mongolia is high is because the efficiency and productivity is low. And that's exactly what Deborah was talking, or Björn presented yesterday, that, okay, there are ways to go around reproduction strategy, improve it. There are ways to increase animal health, decrease animal stress, work on feeding practices, working on feed quality, and so on. But it also depends on what system we are talking about. If we are talking about the grass-fed, grass-finished system, the second solution is really important, the pasture side. If we are talking about feed and fodder production for improving diet quality in the feedlots, then hayland and the hay productions and crop production is the important aspect. So that all comes to feed management and nutrition. But Canada has done a lot of genetic work around the beef industry, and you may have seen this, that recently, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a paper came out about the greenhouse gas emission from Canadian beef industry, and my colleague Tim McAllister compared 1981 to 2011, the two census years that we had. And they realized that when they look at the entire system, they reported that the greenhouse gas emission from beef production in Canada was reduced by 30% between 1981 and 2011. How that happened? Part of that was, of course, working on the feed and so on, but a lot of that was around the genetic, not just about the animal itself, but also about the microbiome and what microbiome It's in the Roman, basically. And so that's the way that they could decrease greenhouse gas emission. So they reported everywhere. Of course, there are a lot of people against this report as well. But that's the reality, that a lot of this beef is produced in feedlot, and they had the opportunity to work with animal and have animal that have better microbiome. And they do a lot of research on microbiome in Canada and in other countries, basically, just because that's really important. You can't waste the food. If you produce the food for a feedlot, you can't just waste it. That's exactly Deborah's point, that we have to increase that, I think, about feeding to gross, basically, ratio. That's what we want to do. And it's genetic, and improving breeding is part of that. So we talk about herd management practices, unproductive animals and so on yesterday. That's really important to be to take care of. But what in terms of the pasture? So I have two pictures for you here. I took them in June, my first trip to Mongolia. I was amazed by the landscape and the hospitality of people, including all the people who supported us so far. And what makes me really unhappy about Mongolia is landscape like this, the river bank. And that's about like something that is more like kind of high water table, maybe kind of fen or wetland sort of vegetation. So these are huge capacity, basically. And I'll explain this afternoon or later, I guess, later about this. But really, there is no management right now for this. There is a huge capacity here for carbon sequestration. And it can go very well with the livelihood of the herder. It can support the herders, and they can be rich if they can do good management and if there are good programs in place. So these are basically probably the most important one that you need to do in order to restore this capacity, supporting the stocking rate that is optimized, a seasonal shift, going back to 4-season traditional rotational grazing for area like this, even within a season, is so important. Rehabilitation of vegetation and enhancing soil carbon sequestration is definitely the key. The problem with greenhouse gas emission is that animals move around, animals on stress for food, and animals, they don't get enough food or quality that they need. So, but this is not only one about like food productions. When you compare these two systems, pasture raised and feedlot raised, you are comparing a multifunctional to a single function system. In a multifunctional system, you have a lot of other environmental services that most of them are undervalued. In a single function, you mostly talk about production, basically, because that's your goal. You want to increase your production. But really, maybe it's worth the extra effort when you do pasture-raised livestock, but you have to do it in a way that you can decrease greenhouse gas emission. One solution Deborah explained, and then Björn also explained yesterday, is just develop a market for the younger animal. Become a cow-calf operator, basically, like many in Canada are cow-calf operator, and so on. And I'm from Iran, and I know that the Iranians like to have a sheep which is maximum 8-9 months old. That's the meat market in Iran, basically. So there's a lot of opportunities like this that you need to look into that in terms of the greenhouse gas emission. But it's part of the assessment that we did. Okay, with the feedlot, you try to maximize product anyway. But when you maximize the product, you are impacting a lot of things, basically. You're impacting soil quality regulations or climate regulations. That's the carbon GHG part. You are impacting water quality and quantity by manure management, as Deborah explained. You are impacting biodiversity because there's land conversion and agricultural activities. And so, again, the reason that people don't care much about this is that right now in the market, what is valued is meat production or livestock production. There is no value for carbon. There is no value for water purification. There is no value for water quality and groundwater discharge. So if we would have had a value for biodiversity and all of these things, then maybe Herders had a different livelihood. Maybe herders had another source of livelihood. And that's exactly what a lot of countries are working on this, including Canada. I was part of this work recently for Alberta. A lot of people thinking about carbon market and a lot of carbon aggregator, and everyone is after carbon market and so on. That's a great idea, basically. But it might be great more than just carbon. It might be that we get a market for grassland conservation. It might be that if we protect as a herder 1 hectare of grassland that is healthy, that has carbon sequestration, water purifications, groundwater recharge, biodiversity, and all the other aspects, it might be that we will have buyers, and they, instead of buying carbon for carbon offset, they can buy grassland credit. And that's what we prototype in Alberta recently, and we are trying to prototype. And this is a good example again. Biombo, you can stop me anytime, basically. Don't worry means another 5-10 minutes. So, but when we talk about the grassland conservation market, basically, you talk about different aspects. Here with this example, with food biodiversity, it's so important. A lot of farms in Canada and lands in Canada either converted, including the beautiful wetlands or little wetlands that hold biodiversity. 76% of the grassland is lost. And there are a lot of farms that it's wheat farm, barley farm, and then the area that we have this little temporary wetland, the crop can't grow because it's flooded most of the time. It's full of the water. So if we can protect those back, if we can put them back, then that will be great. Why it's important? It's basically because they hold biodiversity, because they hold carbon. And that's exactly like around the river bank here, basically. They hold, this specific site that I met has more than 300 tons of carbon per hectare. And this one was even stronger in terms of the carbon, basically, because it was a kind of peatland. And if you do something with the livestock, just make sure that the streams and wetlands and riparian areas and riverbanks are protected enough at the season that they are sensitive, in the spring and in the fall. In summer, you can do grazing, you can rotate. You can do protections and so on. And then you can, of course, you have a choice to think about the socio-economic pastoral system in Mongolia and go beyond that, or just go with two of these. This was through a long-term discussion with the producer that what we should put there. And they told us what we should put there, basically. We ended up with this. I know that the soil, biodiversity, and waters are the key. The cultural aspect, Mongolia has tons of cultural aspect. They can put it there in terms of the grassland and so on. But then when you do all of this, basically, you can decide how you want to weight it. And this is how beef producers in Southern Alberta weighted this different angle of this grassland conservation. You can have a different value for Mongolia for sure, because it might be a different conditions anyway. But you can have a producer with 250 hectares, but you can give him at the end 150 hectare credit, because that's the area that was really protected. That's the area that was really can go to the market. And now a buyer can come and say, okay, I buy 150 hectare instead of 150 million tons of carbon, CO2, or whatever, basically. So that's the concept that can cover different aspects of ecosystems. And that's the concept that probably works better for protecting our environment and also for protecting our tradition. Just wanted to share this with you. A lot of farmers were involved through this process. I was involved because of the soil carbon. And as you can see here, when we went through the biodiversity, of course, you can talk about how much land is protected, how many species and so on. But specifically about water and carbon, water quality and water quantity are a big part of this, including manure management, because we have a lot of peatland. But in terms of the soil, you see that I have put a few. First one is soil aggregate stability. So important, critical. Everything that we save as a carbon in the soil is related to soil aggregate stability. If you don't have soil aggregate, if you don't have soil structure, you can't store carbon there. Then bacterial or fungi ratio. This is important when we talk about the soil health and productivity. If you have unhealthy conditions in terms of soil microbiome, you may end up with a lot of decomposition and a lot of respiration and carbon loss, and you cannot protect enough carbon. Or you can see here more than that, even like, what is the last one? So soil organic matter, of course, is the key, you always know. But we tried here to cover different aspects of the systems. If you look at the soil has different, soil health has different components for the soils to be healthy. And we try to have all of this here basically, but it can be more and can be less for Mongolia. So I just tried to walk you through some of these, what is happening basically in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emission and livestock. Why people are against livestock production, and what are the opportunities, what are the systems, what are the problems basically, where we have improvement. And I was just thinking that what I can put here, and I thought that what I put in my report probably would be just easier to copy and paste here, just to be lazy. But honestly, I think that, okay, the key would be anything that we want to do with the greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration, the key are herders, basically. They have ecological knowledge and they can contribute a lot, and we can support them and we can identify if it's herd restructuring, everything that is needed to do to get down to basically decrease greenhouse gas emission. But this would probably require a lot of systematic change in Mongolia. It could be maybe a cultural shift, it could be a policy shift, it could be like a science shift. Right now, maybe there is not much communication between scientists and governments and herders. And I see a big gap here, basically. I go to the conference in Canada, basically, to producer conference. I go a lot because we have a environmental impact assessment project. When I talk about the paper, basically, the producers have said, no, you're not updated. That's the paper that came out yesterday. And they are really aware. And that's not because they have access to Web of Science and the paper. That's because the scientific community is trying to basically extend and work on this communication, basically, that they are aware of what is happening. And so that is what probably is really needed also in terms of the cultural shift. But community-based range and monitoring is definitely the key. If you want to develop any market in future, if you want to develop any carbon market, grassland market, whatever, you need monitoring and you need a good evaluation and verification. I talk about that this afternoon. And then, of course, you have to think about like what kind of data is needed. Right now, we are very limited with data in Mongolia. Honestly, the open data concept should be part of this revolution here. There is tons of information, but no access. Or if we have access, basically they are not harmonized. So you can't use it for a consistent greenhouse gas emission or carbon sequestration assessment due to scale problems, the different protocols, and so on. So overall, I think the opportunity is here. I have seen a lot of these beautiful valleys with meadow-type vegetation, with riparian ecosystems, even rangelands. There's a lot of opportunity here. The fact is that you need to convince people that they have another livelihood that they can basically support this kind of program. And that's basically is you need a pilot. You need something to demonstrate that it works. And you need to let people that, okay, yeah, this is the way that it works. This is the way that you get more benefit. This is the way that you get more tourists around your farm or your grassland and so on. So these are the things that needs to be done. In the afternoon, I will talk about first about greenhouse gas emission calculation, and then I will talk about soil carbon sequestration, a little bit about what is happening in terms of the approach and the pros and cons for different approach, and also some calculations or some more discussions around the number that I put in the report for this project. But saying that, that was just demonstration for sure. That's not really the final numbers that you can take it to the market or to the offset program. That's just to demonstrate that how valuable this ecosystem or this grassland could be. So I'm happy to answer if there is any question. This beautiful birds came into our Nature Links app, which is a citizen science app. We use it, and a lot of times we get more than 4,000 records of species across Alberta every day, basically. And then we use those information in our modeling and in our science development and so on. That's my email address, and I'm on LinkedIn, and thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. So this session, we talk a little bit about like a GHG emission, the direct emission, and in the next session, we talk about carbon sequestration. So I expect that this one will be faster than the other session. What I want to cover here quickly is about life cycle. Of course, we talk a little bit about that. Life cycle impact analysis is what most important for this topic. And then we talk a little bit about the different approaches and data information needs, very quick. And then we talk about the numbers that we got from the Zoom, from Bayantum and Zoom, and we showed you last week, and then yesterday, and we'd say how this calculation has been done and what are the limitations. So when we want to do greenhouse gas emission assessment, and in case direct greenhouse gas emission from livestock, basically we put it in the context of livestock life cycle. This is something that I got from one of the paper that I was involved for Canadian beef industry. But you have seen the same graph yesterday that we modified for the Mongolian traditional grass-fed, grass-finished, and then also for the feedlot suggestion. So that was basically the base, and then we use that as a base to develop those. But when we talk about the life cycle, we have to take into account, first we have to develop a boundary, which we discussed this morning. We talk about the livestock farming. So we go up to the farm gate. After that would be a different story. We don't want to cover it today. But up to farm gate, we might have different stage of production. So like in this case, we have cow-calf, you have it in Mongolia. And then from cow-calf, you have backgrounding and finishing, that everything is happening on pasture, basically, and rangelands. In this case, some of the animals go to the feedlot with a better performance and better food quality and digestibility, and some animals stay on the pasture. But in the context of life cycle assessment, you consider each of these stages, and then for each stage, you try to quantify input and output. Here with the cow-calf, most of the things coming from pastures, but they also need supplementary food. For example, they need barley, and they need other supplementary input to protect the mom and also the cows from to be ready for weaning, basically. But when it gets to the feedlot stage, that's where you bring a lot of land use change, because you have to produce barley, you have to produce silage, you have to produce corn, and all the supplementary food that comes, for example, that is part of the land use change. And land use change has consequence for both direct emission and also for losing the soil carbon. So in the context of the livestock life cycle impact assessment, you can say life cycle carbon impact assessment, life cycle water quality assessment, life cycle biodiversity impact assessment, which I'm doing right now for the Canadian beef industry. But the important part is that to understand the input and output in terms of greenhouse gas emission. And that is the difficult part, that basically when you do a life cycle analysis, you really get to the complex situation where you need to do a lot of assumption. And that's where the expert opinion come in place. Expert opinion is always great when there is no data, but it's also very dangerous, because an expert can be like me to just make some sort of assumption which is not valid, or it could be a good expert that has tons of experience. Experience that we get from the literature is how it is. We can see it on the screen. We talk about life cycle analysis. 86% of this has been done for the developed countries. And for Asia and for Latin America, for Africa, or for traditional system in general, there is not much life cycle impact assessment studies, basically. And that's why whatever is developed in this area, basically, is based on the industrialized board. And so when you come to the Mongolia and you want to do life cycle analysis and greenhouse gas emissions, you start to get confused, basically. Okay, I don't have land use change. I don't have fertilizer use much. I don't have that much of animal feed import and export. I have a different system. It's a traditional herding system. And so if you want to use any of this life cycle analysis, it's really hard, because the basic is around the industrialized livestock production system. So you need to make a lot of assumptions, and assumptions can be sometimes very hard for when you don't have the data. Now, if you look at the IPCC, IPCC started with a tier 1, and then they moved to tier 2 and tier 3 in terms of the greenhouse gas emission assessment. On the screen here, you can see the baseline, like how the baseline is developed, or the method, data requirements, level of complexity and uncertainty, and then, of course, some additional note. I took it from one of our recent work. I was involved with a carbon aggregator virus solution. We were asked to develop a roadmap for greenhouse gas emission assessment in Canada. And we were a group of 20 experts. I was one of them, basically. And we tried to put a report together. I took this from that report just to show you, if you are not familiar with any of these three, get more information. What is obvious is that here is that tier 1 was the most simplified version. But you simplify basically everything. And that means what she talked this morning about, emission factor. Emission factor is developed by IPCC, and you can use those directly, or you can just get a group of experts in Mongolia, as you have different committees, and then you can adjust those for the Mongolia condition. That's a simplified version. But if you move from that, you need more data. You need data on land use, you need data on animal, farming practices, and so on. And then you use more complicated system, which is really data demanding. But still it's modeling, still it's estimation and simulation, which does not work for many, many areas, because models are not that developed. If you talk about the hydrology model, the hydrological models are very well developed, because you have spatial and temporal data. If you have a station, you can have hourly water data from a gauge station. But with the carbon data, with the biodiversity data, you can't have hourly, monthly, or even yearly, basically. So the hydrological model is well developed, but when it comes to the other aspect of the environment, they are not that developed. And it's not only Mongolia, everywhere is the same. So you need, as a modeler, you need to basically be expert to make the right choice in validation and calibration of your model. Otherwise, the result is not valid. Otherwise, it's like this, that you give the model to a computer scientist and they understand the modeling very well and they produce something for you. But they have no idea if they are doing a great job or not, because it doesn't, maybe the result is totally off. But then tier 3 is basically the most expensive one, as you see at the end, because you have to measure everything. And no country has the capacity to measure everything, or no farmer or herder has the capacity to measure everything. But still, it's important, because a lot of, in the modern world and in the maybe more developed countries, a lot of people, they still want to measure for any reason, for offset program and so on. So they have a chance to go through that. So now, in context of Mongolia, where we can start calculation, basically. I mean, that we have to be realistic. We are in a country that we have probably a lot of rangeland monitoring data. I am not sure yet that how much of those information is publicly available. Maybe it's available. And then we have a lot of groups and scientists and corporation and consulting that they have their own data, but it's not open, basically, right? So everyone owns the data, and there are data privacy, understandable, and so on. But someone like me, when I come and I want to do something, it's really hard because we don't have those information. So I have to think about, oh yeah, maybe Dornard is similar to Southern Alberta, or maybe this is like this, like that, or going through the literature, basically. And so you most of the time, you may end up with the tier 1, basically. It's not just about the data, it's also about like that your system is not represented well in IPCC or life cycle analysis. And so this is where basically all these climate experts try to struggle how to manage things and so on. And I had the same thing, but I thought that I can put it here for those that are not aware of this. And when you go to tier 2, for example, and you want to use the tools, of course, there are tools that are available. Canadians are proud of their HOLOS model, basically. And it's basically for greenhouse gas emission at the farm level. So for each farm, you can basically run the model and then provide the information and get the greenhouse gas emission. And then you can upscale it to the region and so on. Still, the soil organic carbon part is weak because it's based on the century model and it needs a lot of calibration and validation. And because we don't have data, we usually simplify it and just try to come with something. For the methane and for the direct emission, of course, they have their numbers based on the experiments and based on the measurements, real measurements. So they are doing a good job with that one. But this was developed in the context of Canadian livestock industry and agriculture industry. But there are other tools, like I put here, Cool Farm. FAO has developed, for example, GLEAM through the LEAP program. The others developed Cool Farm tool, which was also suggested for this project, basically. But really, when you get to the Cool Farm tool, there are perennial grass. But most of the time, with most of these models for greenhouse gas emission and for carbon sequestration, the problem comes when you look at the grasslands, and grasslands are not monoculture. Grasslands are polyculture systems. That means that there are many species involved. A barley field is simplified. It's one species. If you get to the grassland, there are so many different, that's where the biodiversity and plant compositions comes into place. And the models, they assume grasslands, but grasslands in North America is grassland, grasslands in Mongolia is grassland, basically. There is not much difference, basically. And so that's where the numbers start to get crazy when you run any of these models. So any of these tools that are available, that are mostly based on the tier 2, not tier 3, they have some difficulties and they are data demanding and not very well all the equation behind the scene is developed to represent any different livestock production system. specifically for extensive system and traditional herding, basically. So again, you start to get confused about what to do with the greenhouse gas emission in this case. And so this is one example from the GLEAN. GLEAN was developed by Global Livestock Environmental Assessment Model, was developed by FAO. If you are familiar with the LEAP, LEAP program, they have reports for biodiversity impact assessment. They have method for carbon impact assessment, for greenhouse impact assessment. Just type in LEAP, FAO, and you get all the report. I contributed recently to the biodiversity piece. And we are writing right now one paper out of that 150 pages to send it to the journals for publication. But when you look at this, you see that the level of the information that they need is really detailed. Like you have, of course, the number of animals and you know the species and so on. But when you get to the energy requirement, feed intake, and herd productions, whether this is meat, milk, and all of these factors, basically, when you get to all of this and you want to set up your model and your tools, then you have to make a lot of assumptions. So you get to the point that, okay, can I go with the literature and get just the emission factor from the literature? Or should I really run this? So of course, if you have time, we can definitely try, but you can't just do garbage in, garbage out. You have to bring the good data that you get good results. Garbage in, garbage out is quite common in modeling world. And a lot of people does that, basically. So you don't want to just show people that, okay, I did modeling. You want to show that I did a good work. And always there are shortcomings and limitations, and you want to put that in your report that that others are aware of it. So I have seen this before, but again, in terms of this project, and as I've explained before, we look at the emission sources based on the CO2 equivalent, and that was mostly based on the enteric fermentation, and we basically assume that, okay, because due to grazing, there is no emission coming from the grazing. That we know maybe this is conservative, because if you have a sort of good vegetation composition, that's true. But if you have a degraded land, all of these grazing activities and so on will create more emission from the surface. So here we were very conservative. We said, no, we assume that in Dornot, because a lot of reports says that rangelands are not as degraded in other part of the country, then maybe this is a right assumption. And like you always, when you want to make this kind of analysis, you assume an average climate condition, because if you have a drought, everything would be totally different. Direct emission from animal will be increased, from the soil will increase, and so on. And if you have a good market for livestock, maybe a lot of livestock are sold out. If you don't have, maybe you keep more livestock, basically, looking for a better market. So you just make some course assumption and you try to find the best information from the studies, previous studies and report. And, you know, some of the informations are in great literature. Some of them are published in published report, easily accessible. But in gray literature, it's hard to find. And there are a lot of data sitting in the government offices and so on. That's another level of complexity. So here we tried our best. And we look at specifically at examples that was explained yesterday about herd restructuring. And for those who were not here yesterday, we talked that herd restructuring could be one option to get rid of unproductive animal and just decrease the number of animal. So consequently, we can decrease greenhouse gas emission. And this is a figure that we developed for this project. And we discussed about going completely grass-fed, grass-finished, and going with backgrounding and then feedlot finish. So we wanted to show the numbers here, that how numbers would change if we go from the current conditions to a modified or improved herd compositions or restructured herd. What we did, basically, not just herd restructuring, we also tried to look at what if we improve management of pasture, and what if we improve livestock productivity. And so here I put two examples for you. This one is, of course, from milk production, but you may get the same figure for meat production. There are a list of improvements here in terms of the animal side, animal level that I explained this morning. And when you look at this, you can get up to 30% decrease in amount of greenhouse gas emission if you work with the animal level, the animal side. If you work with the improving productivity and also with different production system, which is here, forget about the organic part. It's very confusing with the number, and as highest number. Let's not talk about that for now. But if you go from conventional to conventional plus feedlot, that means that backgrounding and then finishing in the feedlot, and then going to the what we always suggest for the areas like in Canada, crop livestock rotation system. Bringing livestock as part of the solution to the landscape. That's something that is promoted also, to not have just a simplified landscape covering by annual crops. We want to bring livestock to have perennials as well. And then you will go completely to feedlots, basically. So you see that the numbers are decreasing. And you see that these are the CO2 equivalent per kilogram live weight. But if you start from conventional, 15.92, when you get to the feedlot is 12. So this gives you some idea, basically, that how much improvement I may get if I go from a traditional system to a mixed system, which has both conventional, traditional herding as backgrounding, and then I sell out all of my young animal at the weaning age, and then they will raise in the feedlot and we send to the market. So you can get some numbers from here, and based on the literature, you can see which one makes more sense for your study area, and then you can use it for your calculation. Again, this is not the best way to do it, but this is the minimum that you can do, the starting point that you can really demonstrate how this analysis can be done and how this assessment can be done. And this is what I have done. I want to switch to one of the Excel file that I have here. I hope that Zul is also, I have to send it to you again. Sorry. Just give me 1 second. Unfortunately, internet is so slow, and I don't know if I can send it or not. So I just sent the Excel file. Maybe you can open it. I'll just take a look, but I wanted to show you here quickly what I have done. Sorry. Okay, when you go through the literature, you try to, there are several spreadsheets here, and then you see for each one, I try to collect as much as information as possible, like this one, that how much CO2 per kilogram live weight goes to different part of the life cycle from this study, or sometimes you get the numbers from the reports, like this one, carbon balance sheep and beef farm, was from New Zealand, I guess. There are numbers that you get from the other sources and so on. This one was from a study that was done in China, and then it's compared grazing lengths, whether this is continuous grazing, whether this is grazing, seasonal grazing, and so on. And so here what I did, I tried to collect all the relevant information, and I tried to go through around 100 reports and publications. And so I wanted to make sure that I get the best data, basically. And that comes to the emission factor that she talked about. The range of emission factor that you get from the Canadian beef industry, for American, for New Zealand, Australia. These are the countries that have the best information. Some European countries. There has been a lot of work in Inner Mongolia and also in Mongolia that you can get some information from. And every of these studies have a different situation, basically. Some of them are looking at the vegetation type. Some of them are looking at the animal type. Some of them are looking at productivity improvement, pasture improvement, and so on. So this is what I tried to do, right? I tried to go through every report that I had and really went to the numbers and see how much they reported, and number has been changed, and from different countries, from different animals, for different greenhouse gas emission, and so on. And when I did all of this, then I tried to come with a table like this, which is the calculation table. And everyone, if you want this, you can get it. Basically, it's in the report. And I had limited time. Maybe there are more literature that you can take, but when you go, you look at the location, and I looked at make sure that we are talking about the similar climate and similar vegetation and so on. I didn't put this here because I wanted to put in the report, and it was too much. But then in the literature, you get baseline condition, you get for pasture management and improvement, you can get for livestock management, or for both, basically. And the numbers would be intensity based on kilogram CO2 per kilogram live weight, or kilogram CO2 equivalent per head per year, basically. Both numbers are possible. So I collected all of this information, and then you see that every study is different. I have even from studies from Argentina, tried to match the ecosystems from China, New Zealand, Western Canada, Mongolia, Scotland, India, even, and so on. So I tried to really get and come to the conclusion that I call it expert opinion, basically, and think through and say, okay, yeah, maybe this works for Mongolia, maybe this is the best range. And so out of this, I tried to get a range of greenhouse gas emission, but not based on the live weight, based on, because we have the number of animals, basically. We don't have really good information. We do have about the meat production and so on. On the live weight, we don't really have the live weight that they just say this is the total live weight and so on, unless we make some assumption again. So I wanted to get per head of animal, but I wanted to make sure that in Mongolia, animals are grassland. If it's a cow, it's about 4 years, as we saw on the graph yesterday. Or if it's a sheep, it's longer than a year, basically. I wanted to make sure that all of these conditions is considered. So when I did my assessment and literature review, I ended up with some sorry, I have so many files. I think it's this. Yeah. When I did that, I ended up with this uncertainty range, what I call it a minimum and maximum range. The number that you can see on the screen here is that you can have a range of 1.73 ton CO2 equivalent per head per year. And that is basically on average for the entire life cycle of animal. When you put animal from the younger animal to the older animal, but you have to consider that for that you can't consider calf as a one animal, basically. So 3 of them would be one adult. This is how you do the sheep unit equivalent, or you do the cow unit, basically. So it converted all of those to adult cow. And then we had a table with the current condition with the 20 adult cow. And this was the example that we showed you yesterday. So we have 92 animal, and then the total unit would be 70. And then we get the live weight and so on. We discussed this yesterday. And then we have minimum and maximum emission. So, and we try to make this in a way that making sure that we really cover different situations. We don't want to come to the lowest number because we don't know exactly. We didn't measure that. you have the minimum and maximum number, so you can calculate everything, and at the end you can come to a number per kilogram live weight, because you know how much is produced in terms of live weight, and then you know the average for the live weight, which is down here. And then you do it like for different conditions. This one is now with the one that we have 40 cows instead of 20. The number of animals is the same, but the unit would be different, of course, when you convert them to adult cow. But you do the calculations, you have minimum and maximum, and you try to see what would be the end result in terms of kilograms CO2 per kilogram live weight. So you see the number is much lower. And the reason is that while you send the animal, or you sold the animal at a younger age, and you send them to the feedlot, basically. And so based on the literature, you know, I didn't put all the calculation here, of course, but you know that how much decrease in greenhouse gas emission you will have when you put the animal in the feedlot. And so you can basically look at the number again, and also look at the number for the grass-fed or grass finish conditions. And then you can do it with the pasture grazing improvement or livestock improvement. Remember that in literature I had percentage, as I showed the graph, percentage for pasture improvement, percentage for livestock productivity improvement. And so you can basically work with those numbers and try to see what would be the outcome. For example, if you go with the grass-fed or cow-calf, this would be the numbers that you ended up. And if you go with livestock improvement, numbers would be a little bit higher, basically. So when you do all of this, basically, you ended up with a table like this. Again, you didn't run any model. You don't have detailed information, but you carefully looked at the literature, and you carefully tried to come with an uncertainty range. This is not an absolute value, and I might be wrong. Maybe tomorrow someone came, or today someone says, okay, now I have a report that these numbers are wrong. Remember that this is not about whether this number is 100% accurate. This was about demonstration that you can decrease greenhouse gas emission if you do improve livestock productivity or pasture management. So here I summarize the current condition, the traditional for 20 cows. The numbers are really high per kilogram live weight. I explained in the morning that numbers from New Zealand, and I said Mongolia numbers are close to the largest number that was reported, basically. And these numbers are not wrong for sure. But now, then you restructure the herd, and you have option, going cow-calf, going grass finish, or going feedlot finish. And then you can add into that grazing management to restructuring, and add grazing management or livestock improvement. So I tried to get all of this from the literature and do these calculations, and I tried to see what would be the outcome. Okay, we know that if we go grass finished, is traditional condition. In the current model, you had 20 cows. Here you have 40 cows. The current, but here when you restructure, you have 40. So you expect to have more greenhouse gas emission. So you don't expect to get green values here. It would be higher because cows are emitters. Cows are great emitter of methane, basically. So you can't really hide that, okay, yeah, I restructured the herd, but you had 20 and now you have 40, so you see some increase. But if you go cow-calf, that we expect in future, maybe a lot of herders decide to go cow-calf and become cow-calf operator, then there won't be question about the greenhouse gas emission. They can decrease by this absolute amount, or they can by this percentage. The greenhouse gas emission can be reduced. And the same when you go with the feedlot system, you see that in most of the cases, the feedlot numbers are improved much better. Of course, if you go in this case, only restructure and send them to the feedlot, still you have a lot of animals that are emitter in the first stage, and you get high values, higher than, so there is not much decrease. But you can decrease that number, as you can see here, by improvement in pasture or improvement in the productivity. So what does this mean, basically? You can do the same things for sheep as well, which I think I can show you later. But yeah, here, a general conclusion with 23%, you decrease the greenhouse gas emission. Now, you don't want to just advertise this number, oh yeah, we can do this, we can do that. We didn't measure this. But if someone comes to sue and question the livestock industry, you can argue that, okay, we have done a preliminary analysis and we looked at the literature. It was not tier 2, it was not tier 3, it was mostly emission factor, but there are capacity. So livestock can be part of the solution as well. There is capacity within the livestock sector to improve the situation. And that's exactly what we need to do to demonstrate. We don't want to make any market or offset program out of this. So this is another example with the sheep. Everyone can guess that sheep is much more different than cows. Cows are great emitters. Sheep have less emission, basically. For average for a cow is about 2,000 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per year per head. For sheep is about 200. So there's a big difference, basically. And then the other thing is that here you have a herd size of 100 and you compare it with a herd size of 100. So you didn't double it from 20 to 40 that you get for current condition higher numbers. But you see, constantly you can improve all of this, basically. You can have 43% less based on this calculation. You can decrease greenhouse gas emission directly if you work around restructuring, grazing management, and productivity improvement. And this is while you increase somehow you increase a little bit like the revenue for the herder as well. And the GHG emission can be even further dropped by livestock productivity improvement and pasture improvement. As you can see here, as we move down, sometimes we get the numbers, if you compare with this number, sometimes we get the numbers that was close to the New Zealand numbers, basically. Of course, the New Zealand number that I showed this morning had also carbon sequestration. But if you bring the carbon sequestration, you see that we are not that far. We can get to that point. Even in Mongolia, there is less input compared to the pasture system in New Zealand. They still use a lot of input for raising the animal. Here is really traditional. There is not much input. Okay, so, but you can a little bit upscale this. This is very dangerous to do this job. Because in the previous slide, I did it for 2 clear examples for average herder. With a 20 cow going to 40 cow, but restructure, and 100 ewe going to 100 ewe, but restructure, removing all the unproductive animal and selling the younger to the market, basically. So, but I was thinking that, okay, I have done the carbon sequestration for the entire SUM, which I will show you in the next session. And now, maybe I can upscale these numbers also for the entire SUM in terms of the direct greenhouse gas emission. So I looked at the literature again to make sure that I find one study at least that has constant number for all these animal type that we have. So I found this study, 2022 study, and the author shared with me all the background information. It was very nice. And I know that this is not perfectly fit to the situation in Mongolia, but quite close, basically. And I thought that the numbers maybe not too rough, not too bad in terms of different animals. So yeah, horses are less emitter for sure. That's understandable, 910 kilogram. Cattle about 3,000. Camel about 1,600. Sheep about 260. This is the very conservative value for sheep and also for goats. I tried to get real conservative value that just make sure that, okay, what we can get out of this. So we know that the livestock has increased in the region, in the zone between 2017 and 2021, 57, the livestock population has increased by 57%. That's based on the statistic that is available. Okay, if we get the trend from I got a trend from 2017 annual trend to 2021, and I use that rate, and I assume that if the number of livestock is going to be increased in future with the similar rate that we experienced between 2017 and 2021, then how many livestock we would have in the zone in 2025? Well, there are a lot of factors involved. We have maybe a zoo, 40% of animals are gone, or maybe we have a good market, 20-30% of animals gone, or maybe we have none of these, and the number of animals increased like crazy with the horses coming, unregistered animal, and so on. But even if we take the historic trends, we ended up with a lot of more animal, like compared to almost 100,000 more animal, basically. We go with that rate. Okay, but if we basically do herd restructuring, because when we do herd restructuring, we can decrease the grazing pressure. And with those two examples, with the cow, when we restructure, we could decrease the total cow unit by 20% and total sheep unit by 30%. So if you assume this number, that you can restructure the herd, and it takes 4 or 5 years to 2025 to complete this herd restructuring, then you can optimize your population, animal population. And so then you can basically get to a number which is between 2017 and 2021. You can get a number close to that, basically. So this is one way to do optimize the population. Now, for each of these situations, going the current trend or optimize the population, you can take this total carbon equivalent per head per year, and you can say by year to 2025 how much greenhouse gas emission will be increased or can be mitigated, basically, can be removed. And so that's what I did here. I compared the historic condition, 2017 to 2021, the number of livestock increased. And so you see for each animal how much contribution they had. Of course, cattle are the big emitters, but also horses are quite significant. Then you can also have, when we compare 2021 to 2025, you see horses and of course sheep, but the main emitter would be cows. But then if you compare historic with the optimized population, and that's where you do the herd restructuring, you start to see the numbers start to be green, and you start to see the impact. So, but year 2025, if you compare projected number of livestock with optimized based on the herd restructuring, you can remove 113 tons of 10,000 tons of CO2 in that specific year from direct emission from the livestock sector in the zone. So these are not, again, like numbers to build any policy, but this is a demonstration that maybe herd restructuring can help, maybe sending younger animal to a different system or removing unproductive animal can help. And when you look at the literature, these are not unrealistic, basically. In the literature, you see the same sort of improvement. And so here, at least you make sure that you made assumption, but you also justified or validate your result with the literature. So when you put these numbers, of course, next to the carbon sequestration, we can see with the numbers and the capacity that you're going to miss if you don't do anything by 2025. You will miss a lot of CO2 equivalent removal capacity that you see on the screen. And so like literature are quite different. If you go to Tokyo, they have done a recent study about the carbon sequestration by tree. Of course, the trees are different. But if you take a very conservative value, and this is really the highest value that maybe you can get on the climate condition in Mongolia for a 2 or 3 years tree that you put there, basically a young tree, 20 kilograms CO2 equivalent per year removal, you see that this is equal to a lot of trees, basically. Nothing against tree planting. Tree planting in the right place and in the right condition is perfect. We have to do it. There has been a lot of trees along the river bank in Mongolia. They have been removed. They have been replaced because they are the best place for water purification, for biodiversity, for cultural and tourism, and a lot of values, basically. So that's a great place. The question is where to put the tree. But if you want to give the trees to herders and so on, then you have to make sure that they are successful, because a lot of times these are introduced species or these are commercial species that they have a fast growth rate. The native tree species, they usually are very slow in growing. So, but these are like quite valuable numbers, and you don't want to just go against tree planting, but you want to say that, okay, grassland also has something to offer. And that's the use of this information. And that we are ready to do something, or if we do some improvement, we can get the value out of this. And these numbers are, I think these numbers are quite, can be quite interesting. So, how much time we have? 10 minutes. Good. So we have time for question. So yeah, this is again a preliminary assessment. My expertise is carbon and biodiversity. I am not the greenhouse gas emission guy, basically. I would say that. But I have been involved in many different assessments looking at the greenhouse gas emission as well. What is important here is that this is a preliminary assessment for demonstration. Again, I want to really emphasize this. 5 days of work, doing all of this stuff, my limited time on this project. But it demonstrates that how the system can be more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emission. This is what we wanted to show, wanted to demonstrate that. And we have seen that even with the herd restructuring, sometimes they can increase their livelihood. I leave that part to Dan, my colleague Dan, and also Deborah explain all of this. And Biombo, I'm not an economist. I try to have a great care about the data and so on, and look at really literature and so on, but there's a lot of limitation basically in the database. And one thing that we can get out of this in this kind of assessment, like any other modeling that we do, is to inform about limitation. I have seen that the government people and the groups in Mongolia, they are very good in collecting information. But most of the time, with most of the other governments and other countries, basically, they go after routing information. And there are information that can be part of the survey, like Canadian census information includes a questionnaire about the farming practices that has more than 250 questions, right? And a lot of time, you don't use those information, but suddenly one day you come to a new science and to a new need, and then you go back to that and you get it. Recently, I asked the Statistics Canada, can you give me a map for the beef cow concentration at the 1 square kilometer? They said, oh, we have farm policy, we have to aggregate 5 farms, we can't give you the information per farm. And I said, yeah, you don't need to give me information per farm, but just give me information per square kilometer. They said, no, 1 square kilometer is too small for a Canadian farm, which is true. And I said, okay, yeah, I go through a data sharing agreement and through data privacy and so on. So I signed a few papers and they gave me 1 square kilometer information that I was able to use for assessment of food requirement for beef industry. So the information was there. So when we do assessment like this, you also inform the government basically at which part of the assessment you collect more information from. That's a part that is important. But again, like a lot of this assessment like this suggests that, okay, yeah, we really have to think about something about the potential GHG emission from the sector if we want to compete with with the media. In North America, there are many people who are against beef production. And there are a lot of producers that are proud of beef production. They say that we are protecting the land. And I have one postdoc right now working on how beef production in Canada, extensive beef production system in Canada, can contribute to large-scale landscape connectivity. You know, if we convert these land, the habitats are not connected. And if the habitats are not connected, we go lose the biodiversity. And there are new research that connected habitat have a better carbon sequestration outcome than unconnected habitat. No one thinks that, okay, connectivity has that role in carbon sequestration. For an elk or for a gazelle, Mongolian gazelle, connectivity is a big issue. They want to go from one to the other place. But for carbon, maybe not a big issue, but recent study also shows that how connectivity is important in terms of protecting plant species and in terms of putting more carbon into the soil. So one of my postdoc is doing right now that connectivity study just to demonstrate how beef industry, extensive beef production can contribute to landscape connectivity, because everyone is talking about creating biologically a diverse landscape in North America or in an area that we have simplified landscape due to land conversion. So, and the same example here, like the media is dominated with a lot of, oh, cows are bad and so on and so on. But if you believe that you have to act, then you can basically carefully use some of this number to argue that, no, it's not like this. And there are a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of capacity here. Tier 3, I have seen a lot of studies in Canada, and some other European governments started to put a lot of good information regarding this, but this is really costly. And it will be really hard to do it unless someone really wants to do it for his own business. And there are some regulations and rules now in developed country that they have to do a true greenhouse gas emission assessment. But I don't think that that will be in near future a problem, a case for Mongolia. So I'm happy to take questions. Deborah had much nicer presentation this morning in terms of how she got to the number here. I can't do that because a lot of this is based on the literature review, and then I have to come with the expert opinion and conclusion. And someone told me when I was doing this, someone told me that, okay, how do you know if those literature that you use are accurate? So that's the part that I can't control. I can just see the numbers and I can trust the literature. But for some of you that you are in science, you know that sometimes having a paper in high-level journal does not mean that the quality is good, because there is also a lot of other things happening behind the scene. I am an editor and I know how things works around the science as well. But anyway, I hope that this was a very quick walk through what I have done, my 5-day works, but I'm happy to answer the question if there is any question. I have seen a few of you just taking a nap, so I'm just scared that maybe that was not much interesting. Go ahead, please, question. About a few terms, carbon stock, carbon sequestration. There is a lot of confusion around these terms, basically, and it has huge implications, specifically for the stock change. And then we talk about some approach and some suggestions and the calculation that we did. So again, our part today would be on the carbon source, not on the carbon source, but this session would be on the emission or carbon sink. And 2 pictures here from last year in June. Somewhere that is highly degraded around the water and so on. and like 200 meter, 300 meter away from that, basically, or maximum 400 meter, basically. So these are two situations, not much capacity in terms of greenhouse gas emission mitigation or carbon sequestration, but we see that the capacity that is there, basically. We just need to learn how to do that. Of course, here, there was no water resources, probably. That's why maybe there are not too many animals around, but it was not too far from there, actually. It was 1 minute drive. So before we go to discussion, really, we talk about carbon sequestration, and I wanted to put this here. The reason is that we talk about this healthy soil, and we talk about the function of a healthy grassland soil. And one of the most important function is carbon sequestration, basically. Of course, it provides us a lot of goods. We don't talk about this part. Mostly we talk about the other part. We talk about water purification and soil contaminant reduction. Climate regulation has a direct connection to carbon sequestration and to nutrient cycling, basically. And then we have habitat for organisms. We have flood regulations. We discuss about groundwater recharge and how the water gets to the river if we have a healthy grassland and so on. So that's why we talk about the soil carbon, because soil carbon is one of the indicators of the soil health. And in any literature, you can see that the soil carbon assessment is one of the indicators of the soil health. And that's where we remove CO2 from atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then we put that carbon into the vegetation or into the soil, which is mostly in the soil. But there are a lot of interaction happening here. We have photosynthesis, we have respiration, and we have decomposition. So as a manager and as an ecologist and someone who cares about environment, we don't want to disrupt any of these processes. We want these three processes to work together. A lot of people are thinking that, okay, yeah, just put carbon into the soil. That's not what we want from a system. If there is no flow of energy and nutrient in an ecosystem, then there won't be any good and services from that ecosystem. This is just basic foundation, basic ecology, basically. So we try to protect all this process, and we try to optimize this. We don't want to have extra decomposition and extra respiration. We want to have a healthy cycle of carbon and nutrient in the system. Okay, now I think it's important to know about the grassland systems again and highlight these. And I want to get your opinion on this. I know that a lot of you always heard about soil organic matter. But a lot of people, when they talk about the soil organic matter, they think that, oh yeah, this is just some dead material, basically. But if you look at the definition that I have there, it says mixture of soil microbes, including bacteria and fungi. So you remember in the morning, we talked about grassland conservation, and we put bacteria, fungi ratio there. That's because they are the creator of this great function for the ecosystem. Soil organic matter is more than carbon. And that's the way that the carbon is protected in the soil. But there is a certain amount of carbon in the soil organic matter, basically. So a lot of times when soil scientists or ecologists do soil measurements and soil carbon measurements, they calculate organic matter. And you have heard they say that this soil has 2% organic carbon. For example, in Mongolia, we have Mali soil. I work with the US taxonomy, of course. And Mali soil the requirement is to have 2% organic matter. But when it comes to the market, carbon for market and so on, people talking about the total organic carbon, which is basically a fraction of organic matter, right? As you can see on the screen. So that's why before I go to the next slide, I want to make sure that you understand the differences. We have organic matter, part of it is organic carbon, and that organic carbon can be restored in different parts of the ecosystem. Each of these we call stock. So this is carbon stock in the plant organs. This is a carbon stock, and there's a carbon stock in the soil, basically. So, and the carbon credit is based on this stock. You try to protect soil carbon storage. The measurement is soil carbon stock. And you talk about the carbon stock baselining to say that how much carbon is in the soil. But coming to the grassland, this is a good figure. It shows all those three processes, how they interact, and where the carbon is. So, and I tried to get from the literature in Mongolia to get to these numbers, but I wanted to ask you, see if anyone has any idea of the amount of the carbon stock in the Mongolian grasslands, in a typical grassland. Anyone has come with that number?
Actually, we don't have one unified number. You still like only is the local measurements they do, but I don't know if it is available data. They do some measurement, but it's not available yet. But in for the IPCC, our inventory, we tried to use one, but we still couldn't find, just like you, we couldn't find any data for that.
Right.
So now Japanese government, they try to help to create some database for it and make measurements for it. But the COVID restriction made it stop. So we basically, I don't
Right.
know if we have one, because I was searching for it. I couldn't find one. So,
Right. Yeah, and so that's a great question, great answer. And I wanted to get this out of it, that, okay, there are scientists that are working on experiments or locations, specific locations to get the carbon value for publications or for a specific need, anything. Someone is involved with the international project. And that is exactly the gap. My institute, the job in my institute and my institute's role basically in monitoring is that we go to each of these labs that they do experimenting. They do it at a small scale, right? But they don't have the capacity to upscale. They test, they say this approach is the best, or we test this is great, or we can measure this. But they can't upscale it. They can't go from that specific site to a province, to a country. And that's where we jump in and we say we are monitoring program and we take your knowledge and we implement that and we try to improve our protocol. So by 5 years, we have a complete protocol for carbon assessment that works under different situations. So, and that's where like the monitoring comes in place, basically. So that monitoring piece and that systematic monitoring is the key. But I have the same situation. It's really hard to find carbon data for different ecosystems in Mongolia. So this one is, I leave it to you to talk about this. This came from NASA reports. And I really love these pictures, basically, because it has a lot of learning, basically, in it about that, where we are and what is the treasure that we have and so on. And I really want to ask you, like, what is your observation from this? Well, what do you learn from this when you put it in the context of the Mongolia and traditional systems and grasslands and so on? So we have different biomes, different ecosystems, and then we have different pool or stock of carbon, above ground, below ground. And it's quite interesting, I would say. A lot of us, when we go to tropical regions, we say, oh, so productive, right? So productive, how much carbon we have there. Yeah, because that three process, decomposition, respiration, and photosynthesis, everything is happening very fast. The system does not need to protect much. Come to Mongolia. Not everything is moving fast. This is a harsh environment, a harsh ecosystem, and it has developed over a million years. And the carbon has been stored over a million years here, right? But this carbon pool is huge. So if you lose this, it takes years to get that back, basically. And so this is the importance that, okay, you have the minimum vegetation cover, which drives this carbon. You have to protect that, basically. So one angle would be carbon turnover. The other angle would be that, okay, soil generally is what we really care about. But a lot of people are get confused that, okay, yeah, protect the soil, but you can't protect the soil and carbon without protecting the vegetation. Vegetation is the key. So we have a situation, we have in Mongolia, we have grasslands and we have some wetlands, and wetlands are always well protected. That's why in many like peatlands and so on are so important for carbon and for greenhouse gas mitigation. So now, again, a question for you, basically. What do you feel about grazing? Do you think that grazers can increase carbon sequestration in the soil? A lot of media, they say that, okay, don't graze and then add carbon to the ecosystems, increase carbon stock. What is your feeling about this? What do you think about this?
Have to be grazed.
Have to be grazed. So grazing has a value.
Yeah.
Okay. What else? Grazing has a value. Look at the $1 billion of Canadian for the Alberta's. We did this study. This is on the review in climate change, global change biology. I confuse a lot of things today, but anyway, this is on the review. This is from 3.5 million hectare grasslands that we have. A lot of people are basically saying that no value for grazing. Stop grazing, protect the land, let the bison come back, and maybe and so on, basically. So my colleagues from the Rangeland Institute, I was involved with this project. We collected a lot of soil data. We tried to show what we get out of this, basically. Billions of dollars can be basically is the value of the grazing induced carbon stock, carbon sequestration. But you see that different pools or different stock have different reaction to grazing, basically. And these are very good information for grazing management, basically, for ecosystem management. So not all reacting the same, not all contributing the same, mostly come from the soil. But depends on your need. When you do assessment, you can go with any numbers that you want. You can go with total ecosystem C, which is everything. Or a lot of people only focus on the soil. As an ecologist, I would like to see this one, because this is the three main processes basically that we discussed. But anyway, I don't want to confuse you with a lot of different details and so on. A lot of people think that the litter layer or partially decomposed stuff has no contribution. They have also contribution and so on. I wanted to put this number, this because this is based on real measurements. 250 sites that were basically grazed, ungrazed, or partially grazed. And we have across Alberta these reference rangeland areas. And then we were able to do this analysis. So this is just hopefully get accepted. Also, I I'm expecting that the global change biology will reject this. And the reason is that global change biology takes the examples and the papers that are basically mostly showing that livestock production has impact, basically. This would then be the topic, the title that the global change biology probably will be published. But we wanted to challenge and we wanted to try, and we tried. But getting to interesting stuff. You guys, if you like carbon credit and carbon market, you really have to think about this. This slide and the next slide. There is a lot of confusion about this. And I want you to look at these slides for a moment before I start to talk and read through the slides and see whether you really get what I wanted to present here or not. BAU is business as usual, and then the rest of information is here. A lot of people are confused about carbon stock change, and this figure is showing carbon stock change. But really, what is the change? How we can quantify the change? A lot of people have no idea what they are quantifying as a change. And I'm trying to show here. So 2 examples. One example is about a fixed baseline. Baseline means Lagwa and I want to start a business together. So our baseline is that I have no money and Lagwa has all the money, basically. Okay? And then after 5 years, they say that Lagwa has the same money and I have more money. But we are talking about 2 different things. I'm 2 different person, basically. So we have to, we need to quantify what was earned from the system, not what was earned for myself. I earned from this collaboration, but we have to look at the entire system. So a lot of people, they put fixed baseline. You go to the herder and you say, okay, stop grazing or start rotation. I measure you have 20 ton of organic carbon, or carbon stock is 20 ton per hectare. Now start grazing, and then you come back after 5 years and then you measure and say, oh, it's 25. So I give you 5 ton credit. Is that correct or not? Something is here that we call it as a climate factor. But if you go with a fixed baseline, you assume that every season, every year, plant production is the same, which is not. And then you assume that there is no interaction between climate and management, which is wrong. The correct way is basically to have a business as usual baseline. And business as usual means that, okay, this piece of land is grazed continuously. I measure as long as I measure the other piece that is rotated. So at the same time, you control for everything. Climate, soil is the same, vegetation is the same, you control for climate. And then when you get at the end, you really look at the impact effect from management change. And that's what goes to the carbon market, basically. It can't be like this because you get too much credit. And then after a few years, they come and say, oh yeah, we gave you too much credit, get it back. So it's important basically to understand that we are talking in the development of seeing the carbon stock change. We are talking about comparing business as usual with the change due to management. Now, how about this? And it happened with the carbon a lot of time. You start a project, and that's why sometimes I'm surprised that people say, okay, we did a 3 years project and it was so successful and carbon was increased and so on. Carbon change, carbon has different behavior than many other things, basically. And so you never know where you end up with. So you can have a business as usual, you can improve. So this is the change, this is clear. But what about here? Well, which part do you want the credit for? Suddenly you had a drought and carbon stopped to decrease because system is input and output is more than input, right? Okay, so in this case, do you give the credit or not? In the second case. Yes or no? Yeah, it's of course it's written somewhere here. But really, what is the difference between these two? Here you try to increase, they call it restoration. What do they call it? They call protection. Here you restore, increase the capacity. Here you protect the existing capacity. Both of these has value. And both of these can go to the carbon market. So it's not just always like this, that, okay, I have 5 ton and I want to increase it to 10 ton. And that's where maybe works with the Mongolia. Or try to stop degradation. Protect what you have. Even now, protect what you have. Don't let it go down more. So there are 2 types of credit that can be basically provided here. And understanding of this kind of change is really important when you put a baseline for the carbon. Okay. Any questions so far?
Just one question.
Yeah.
Is grazing helps for increasing carbon stocking in pasture?
How grazing increase? Okay.
You said like there's a publication ongoing and not yet it's under review. And then there's some points about like the soil, the carbon in the soil actually increase the stock of carbon because of the grazing.
Sure.
Can you explain a little bit more the reasons?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you asked this question because grazing is too general, right? When you talk about the grazing, you can talk about the high grazing pressure, you can talk about low grazing pressure, you can talk about optimal grazing. And when you talk about the grazing, you can say early season grazing, continuous grazing, and rotational grazing. That's a great question. And in the context of the Canadian and Alberta's grazing, most of the cases, we are not, the ecosystem is not overgrazed. So in most of the cases, they take care of the land. We don't have much of overgrazing issues. We had that in 1950, and then there was rule and regulations and everything changed. So most of the farmers, they take care of the land. The grazing pressure has not been really an issue unless it's a grazing lease, which is public land. There is less control on that. But on the private land, it can happen. The first point. The second point is that we have something in grasslands called compensatory growth. So if you clip the grass reacts. They start to remove some of the roots, add carbon to the soil, and then they start to grow again. And I had experiments in the Swiss Alps, I had experiments in Alberta, and I had experiments in Iran. When we did clipping, basically, but in the optimal grazing, we put the cages grazed, ungrazed, and we cut the vegetation monthly. And at the end of the season, we realized that there is more production in grazed area than in the fenced area. Okay, but that was a healthy system. That was optimal grazing. So they go and sequester more carbon, specifically nowadays that the carbon intensity and is much higher in the atmosphere, basically. They have the capacity to do compensatory growth and put more carbon into the soil. So I agree that grazing is too general. It depends how we graze. It's not about the grazing, it's how we graze, basically. And here we talked about the ecosystem that has still a good vegetation composition and so on. And the compensatory growth for grassland comes as long as we have grazing. If we don't have grazing, a lot of grasses, they start to die. A lot of grasses, they are not productive anymore. So grazing is part of that. So this was not high grazing or crazy grazing anyway.
And then the implication of this result is not really, because I think you don't have any kind of experience the same health in Mongolia, no?
I mean, there are experiments in Mongolia for rotation and so on. I have not seen any report that take into account the species composition really and link that to the carbon sequestration.
I mean,
with this study we did
situation
that.
for overgrazed systems. Any study on overgrazed system?
What I have seen in Mongolia and in my trip to Dorna, basically, forget about the situation of riverbank and the riparian ecosystem. They are under really problem. The only place that I have seen, the picture that I showed at the beginning of my presentation, basically, there are areas that there is less water and it's not really grazed. And in those areas, you see huge amount of the carbon in above ground and below ground, basically. So if grazing issue in Mongolia, if grazing management start to happen, then we see also a lot of improvement in the system.
And grazing also takes in a side effect of trampling effect.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Thousands of sheep or thousands of horses instead of eating because of the hoovering effect or this trampling effect.
Yeah.
So that's kind of degrading more than this only cutting issue.
Yes. But
if you take into account this matter into your study?
From the greenhouse gas emission, we did greenhouse gas emission in a separate paper, basically. And what I'm talking here in Alberta, we have maybe 90%, 95% vegetation cover. So trampling always help basically to get the seeds established. And Mongolia is different because they need gap in the vegetation to get established. Otherwise competition, they don't let them. So it's always good. But in Mongolia, it's different, basically. The way that the horses are impacting the landscape, you sometimes see the hoof goes down up to 20 centimeters. Specifically, I have seen that in riparian area, 25 centimeters, 30 centimeter hoof down because it's just wet. And that has a huge impact first on water infiltration, and then on all other aspects of vegetation and so on. Trampling, if it's optimized grazing, is a good thing for system. If you have a grassland system, you need disturbance. And disturbance can be clipping, can be trampling. And that's why we don't say early grazing. Early grazing is too bad because soil is wet, because the trampling effect is huge. But grazing at the right time is always good, basically. I give you one example. We have maybe 30 provinces in Iran. Only for one province since 1981, we banned early grazing. And that's where my hometown is, Isfahan province. You fly over Iran in May, June. May, our province is green, all the grass, all the pasture places. The rest of the country is completely degraded. Because early grazing is a big issue. It's where the plants are using a lot of resources. And if you graze them, they're done. They can't do much more. In Mongolia, we have continuous grazing. We have to do something with the early grazing. It's not just about high grazing pressure. It's also about the timing of grazing. And early grazing is something that needs to be taken into account as well. Selling animal younger, that means that you don't need to do a lot of grazing in the springtime, basically. Maybe. So we have to find a solution for that, definitely. And that's basically the traditional herding system that is not anymore in place because there are pasture boundaries and rules, and now they can't move and so on. And they can't do that seasonal rotation. Otherwise, they know it. They know it from the several centuries of doing herding and so on. So it really depends on where we are talking about and what we are talking. I hope I was able to answer your question.
area. We call it protected area.
Yeah.
Basically, there is no animal. The animals, I mean, the sheep and livestock cannot enter there. It's all protected area. So, is it true? My understanding is that grazed area is the where we talk about pasture in Mongolian conditions, situations, and then non-grazed means for us it will be those protected areas, or it's not necessary.
Not necessarily. First of all, I know that in Mongolia for protected area, you have some certain rule for livestock grazing. And in a lot of protected areas, you still have grazing, but they have to follow certain rules. But even if there are not livestock in protected area, why do you want to have a protected area? You want to keep Mongolian gazelle?
Yeah, all those wild animals or those species and tree species.
You don't want to talk about gazelle and larger herbivores in protected area. There are a lot of insect eating plants, basically. There is report and science papers, basically, that shows that the amount of the biomass that is removed in a healthy grassland or rangeland system by insect is about 40%.
So which one is the non-grazed area?
Non-grazed area, I would just say when you fence it, no, nothing else can go in. And those are the exclosures that usually, as a scientist, we use to see how vegetation can be recovered over time. But then you don't keep it for a long time, basically. And that's the fencing strategy that can be used for along the riparian ecosystems and so on.
Okay.
So there is grazing in protected area, different sort of grazing. North America was bison grazing, but bison was grazing for 2 months, and then they were gone for 10 months. And then next year they were grazing the other part. That's what we know from the history. They don't come to the same site. And then maybe every 6 years, the same place had a chance basically to get grazing and high grazing pressure. And that's the concept that they use in North America. They call it high intensity, they call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Put a lot of livestock in a short area, graze everything, that all the animal plants are grazed, move and leave this place for the rest of the year, or at least for 2 months and so on.
Okay, good one.
So yeah, a lot of details about the grazing anyway. Good. So we move to the next. How much time we have? We have time. You are that. Okay. Okay. I think this is also interesting. Carbon stock assessment approach. You have heard a lot about this. And people talk with different terms and so on. And I try to categorize it here. Okay. When we talk about the main assessment approach, we either talk about empirical factor. A lot of people say practice-based factor, which means that I asked Lagwa if you have rotational grazing instead of continuous grazing, then the factor for carbon change is 20%. That means that you increase 20% by 5 years and so on. That can come from literature, can come from other studies, can come from expert opinion, or can come from real measurement, basically. But you give a factor to Lagwa, and then the second producer, if comes, you give the same factor, basically. You treat everyone the same, which might not be a good idea because Lagwa's rangeland might be different than someone else's rangeland, basically. And they might have different capacity to store carbon. They call it factor, like emission factor in tier 1, basically. The second one is measurement. Everyone knows that measurement is the most accurate way to calculate everything, basically. But measurements of the carbon in rangeland is so expensive because rangelands are heterogeneous, not just because of the soil and climate and microtopography and vegetation composition, but also because of the management. Some of the herders have 4 movements, some of the herders have no movements, some of the herders have bigger herds, some of the herders have only horses. So there's tons of different different factor basically involved with the management. So measurement is difficult. Talk about this a little more. Some people, they have hybrid modeling with project management. And these two are very confusing, the last two, modeling supported by monitoring. A lot of people, specifically the aggregators, carbon aggregators now, they set up a model, they do some measurements, they set up a model, and then when the model is set up, they just get all the predictions from the model and develop a carbon market based on that. Okay, and that goes exactly to that fixed or business as usual problem that I explained before. The models, when these models are developed, you can consider one management type, one farmer, one rancher, one herder, but you go to the second herder, they have a different management style. They have different number of animals and so on. And it's really hard to see how to manage this. So I want to talk a little bit about this, but this is the most suggested one that carbon aggregators really don't want to go to this way because this is probably the best way. And then they can't really manipulate the numbers and so on. So that's a business anyway. But then when we talk about like measurements, if we really want to only do measurements, basically we have either direct measurements of the carbon in the soil. You can take the soil sample, you put it in the lab, and then you say this is the amount of the carbon. Or you don't go to the soil, you go to the soil surface, or you try to use the flux of greenhouse gas emission that comes out of the soil. Because anyway, at the end of the day, you want to, if you have offset program or carbon credit, you want to show that how much greenhouse gas emission is removed. And so in this way, you put flux tower, this is the flux tower, and the data that you get, they call it eddy covariance. And NASA is using this to combine it with remotely sensed data to measure greenhouse gas emission and carbon emission and so on. But that one has also a lot of I have done that in the field a lot and in the lab a lot. One day it's windy, the other day is not windy. And then how can you measure it? It needs a lot of spatial and temporal information, and basically linking that to what? You need a lot of other data. If you want to link it to satellite data, then you have difficulties that maybe there are clouds cover and a lot of other issues with the satellite data. And then you are not sure whether the prediction at the end is correct or not. So it's very challenging, but for some of the research and for some of the application, very good. Okay, but the modeling basically quite diverse as well. You have empirical models. I do some measurements in Lagos place, and he says this is the soil carbon. I measure soil carbon, and then Lagos tell me, okay, this is the amount of precipitation, this is the amount of evapotranspiration or whatever, basically. And then I develop a regression model, and then we call it empirical model. And then I say, okay, I experiment everything in Lagos place. Now I can take it to Biombo's place, and I can basically give Biombo a carbon credit based on what I developed in Lagos place. That does not work because the processes that is happening in Biombo's place ecosystem might be different than what is happening in Lagos place. And that's why people, they go after process-based models. The process-based models can be only taking care of the soil or taking care of the entire ecosystem. And so when people looking at different aspects of ecosystem, one guy says, okay, I only measure or model water quality. The other guy says, oh, I only model carbon. But that does not work in this way. If you increase water quality or water quantity, you also increase the opportunity for carbon sequestration. And if you increase carbon sequestration, you increase opportunity for increasing soil water capacity that increase productivity. So there is always feedback. And so that's why people move from empirical model to ecosystem model over time. Like the century is an ecosystem model. But you have heard that people do digital soil mapping still. When machine learning and AI came into the place, everyone said, oh yeah, we can do everything now with the machine learning and so on. But the black box, again, that gives you some empirical relationship. It does not give you the process and the ecosystem view. So here's the point that you want to develop a program, you want to develop a market, you have objectives. And then you have to see which one fits with your objective and with the money that you have. Now, I want to shortly talk about this. I don't want to talk about you implement a factor-based approach, and then you have a duration, and then you say, this is the amount, and I give it to you. Very dangerous. You can't really treat all the people with the same recipe. Some of the people are doing much better job. Some of the people are doing a poor job, and that would be a disaster in developing a market. If you do develop a market based on the factor base, the main problem is that at the beginning, maybe you get a lot of participation, but then over time, you lose participation in the market because they don't trust the numbers. Because everyone feels that can have a different value or a different credit, basically. Now, if you do measurements only, of course, there is a lot of technology development. Maybe a few years ago, we had to dig a soil profile. Now we don't do that. This is an example from Australia. That's an example from Canada, basically. And we have developed that technology. Just take the hydraulic pump. You just take the soil core of 1 meter intact, you put it in a box, send it to the lab. You scan it, and then you cut it in a piece, you send it to the lab, basically. Not difficult, basically. And then you can do it in many places. Lab is still very expensive, but taking the soil core is not that expensive. And then you can do it in an educated way. There are a lot of satellite data available that you can, for example, for Alberta, we have a program for wetland monitoring. And for each pixel of the land, 10 meter by 10 meter, we quantify how many days that pixel of land is covered by water, and if that water is deep or not. So, and those are great information for when you look at the carbon, because a lot of time when you do carbon assessment, most of the carbon is in the lowland, where you have some temporary water or you have wetland. And those are the green areas that at the end of the season, you see animals are grazing there because it has a higher capacity for production. So those kind of information, spatial and temporal information, can provide very good information. And you can do a stratification. You can do what they call it Latin hypercubic sampling. It can give you where to go and collect the sample. So increase the efficiency. But again, expensive. And then one big problem specifically with like a measurement is that if you do the measurements now, year one, and then you do measurement after 5 years, then you didn't consider the business as usual baseline. You consider a fixed baseline because you have a value at the beginning and they have a value at the end. That's misleading. That can't go to the market or to any carbon market or something like that. This is a good example about our system in Alberta, and I have shown this, I guess, before in Mongolia. Maybe I don't know if you have seen it or not, but this is a very clear example of the capacity. This is a sandy soil. You see the soil profile is full of sand, basically, granule soil. And the two farmers next to each other. One farmer keep tillage and keep cropping. The other farmer puts perennial and cover crop, no tilling anymore, and only optimize grazing or cutting, basically. So see how much carbon they could save? They totally change even the structure of the soil. This happens over a 10 years program, basically. So the capacity is there. The plants even can do in these conditions, basically, and they can increase the soil carbon. And when we talk about regenerative practices, this is exactly a good example. Now, with the hybrid with project measurements, I don't want to get your brain so busy here, but it has more or less the same problem with the measurements, that you ended up with a fixed baseline, basically. And then you have a hard time to use the model prediction for any assessment. I don't want to just go deep into that because that would be a little bit confusing. But this is what I also have done. This is from one of my recent work. This is what we call it ecosystem process modeling. We combine modeling and measurement. And so we have measured data. As you can see here, we have the green line. And then we try to calibrate our model. That means that we define what we call it a range, a parameter range, or uncertainty range. And then we try through calibration, bring that, try to calibrate and validate the model. That's the concept that they call it calibration validation. We don't want to talk much about that. But the key here is that you set up a monitoring program, you develop your model, you calibrate your model, and you check your model time to time. You can't have a model that is developed today and then it's still working 20 years later, because climate variability is a big factor. We have long-term climate pattern that maybe happens every 30 years, every 50 years. And if we get in the middle, something like that, then your model doesn't work. So combining continuous monitoring with continuous improvement in the modeling is the key basically here. Anyway, any question? I know that it was not interactive. Any question here?
If no,
Oh, yeah.
this carbon sequestration slide.
Mm-hmm.
One question is there any fertilizer use input to this?
That experiment from Alberta? No, nothing. Nothing. It was just grazing basically. And these are natural, natural grassland. The only human intervention is grazing basically. That's it. No fertilizer. I come back to that fertilizer point as well, maybe later in my slides. Okay, you have seen these pictures today, and you know about this, and you remember that when we talked about herd restructuring, we said that we can decrease grazing pressure with those two examples. 20% if you restructure an average herd for cattle and 30% for sheep. So when I wanted to do the calculations for this sum, I had to make some assumption. And so clearly when you make assumptions, you want to say, what if? We call it what if scenarios. What if grazing pressure decreased and vegetation improved? And so that's an assumption that I made here. Improving grazing management through herd restructuring, which means more intensive to less intensive grazing in the area, because we had 20%, 30% discussion. And promoting seasonal pasture rotation, which means the seasonal movement of the herders, can potentially rehabilitate vegetation. That's the first thing that we want to do first. Work around vegetation, and when vegetation improved, we can improve soil conditions, integrated pasture or rangeland. So that's basically the assumption, which is possible because there is a lot of literature around that. But now, if you do that assessment, basically you want to look 20% decrease by cattle, 30% decrease by sheep. If you do that assessment, that assumption, basically, you can go back again to the same numbers. The current conditions, you have 20 adult cows, and then you have 40 adult cows with the same number of animal, but different number of animal units. And you know that sheep unit or cow unit basically is the measure that we can harmonize and we can compare, like the CO2 equivalent that we talk about. So the difference within this number would be 333 and 267. You have 20% decrease in the animal population. Now, if you take that and put it in the context of carbon sequestration, you have seen this before again yesterday. This is the vegetation map based on state and transition model. And it shows 4 different ecological group sites. You know, Mongolia was divided in 22 ecological site groups, ESG, and then in Bayan-Tum and Sum, we have 4 of them, as you can see on the map here. Okay, each of these have some sort of characterization. When you do carbon sequestration assessment, the first thing that you look is the soil type. A sandy soil does not have the capacity to sequester carbon. It has less capacity to sequester carbon. The reason is that a lot of soil aggregates happens around the clay content, how much clay you have in the soil. So there's a difference between the soil type. Soil type is a factor. Then vegetation type is a factor. Then at what season they are grazed is a factor. And then how intensively is grazed is a factor. So there are a lot of different factors involved with the carbon sequestration. So what I did here, I look at the vegetation plot data from the SUM. I was able to look at them. And then I was able to come with some sort of degradation factor for each of these vegetation types. So we know vegetation type and we know degradation factor. Like if 1 is 0 is no degradation and 1 is completely degraded, you can basically class them based on this information. And then when you have information, basically you can bring it to this table. You saw this table again yesterday. That if we move from highly degraded to the reference state, how much biomass is improved. And if we move from one state to the state, or how much biomass is improved. So this gives you an idea, okay, my first plant community is at the degraded state right now, based on the vegetation plot. And now we expect that if we improve grazing in a 5-year period, 3-4 years period, which we call it short period, we, based on these calculations and based on the degradation level, we can get to a better level. So how much biomass we gain, right? Let's say we get 100 kilogram per hectare biomass increase because vegetation is improved, because these are measurements and there is a guideline for degradation level and so on. So, but 100 kilogram per hectare, how much carbon? That's where you need a carbon factor, basically. Not all the biomass is carbon. How much of the biomass is carbon? Any idea? There are a lot of studies for different species, and for different species, you can say how much carbon is in the biomass. The average is around 40%. The rest of 60%, what is that? Is water, is you can dry it, then there's no water, of course, it's mineral, right? So you say 100 kilogram per hectare increase. Now, how much biomass increase? Only 40 kilogram per hectare. So that's the amount of the sequestration per hectare that you have from vegetation. Okay, this is how you calculate for vegetation, but as we discussed, vegetation is not really our point. They are the drivers of ecosystems. We need to have them, but we look mostly on the soil, because soil is where we have the grasslands. So remember that you need those conversion factor for IPCC says 50%, but in Mongolia's conditions, based on the literature, 40% is a good number, basically. Now, what happened in the soil? Okay, Is this for vegetation? Sorry, this is for the soil. What happened in the soil? So for the soil, you need to go back again to the literature because we don't have much information. I can share this slide quickly if I find it. That's how I basically calculated there for vegetation. You have current productivity, it says between these two numbers. And then, what can you do here? Sometimes the range is it's quite large. So I got that with just one average. That's the average that you can see here. And then based on the photo plots and based on the seasonal pasture and so on, you define a degradation factor, that how much this land is degraded. And then you can adjust your productivity and see how much your productivity basically would be, or how much productivity would be under an improved conditions. And then you use basically you use the factor to come with the vegetation C content, see how much is 41%, and then you go with your calculation for vegetation basically, and you can say based on the ton per hectare, or you can say based on CO2 equivalent. So that's how you do it. But for the soil, what you can do for the soil basically, I have developed the same table as greenhouse gas emission. I had to go through the literature again, and I had to look at carbon sequestration. The numbers that you see here, sometimes it's just a baseline number. It does not say how much annually. It says how much is in the soil. This is what we call it carbon stock. How much is in the soil? But I didn't want to know how much is in the soil. I wanted to know if I improve, how much I earn. So that's the rate. And I tried to get that rate from the literature. And as you can see, here it says downstream wetlands. Some of your conditions can fit to this. It says semi-arid grasslands, mountain estate heavily degraded, and it says lightly degraded, basically. And as we go down, there are more and more. And of course, I looked at the different systems. It says rangeland, typical systems, and it also shows here what they talked about. Heavy grazing decreased SOC, soil organic carbon, by 20%, 27%. So I have all of those remarks there again. So here is where I have to use my judgment, basically, and I say, okay, now, what would be the appropriate range for sequestration? And then I have to match all this vegetation type that is explained here to those 4 vegetation type. For vegetation type 1, the rate would be different than 2, and then 3, then 4, depends on how they match with this literature, basically. And that's how I got basically to a range of different vegetation and so on for my calculations. So like I have here some of the numbers, but I will show you in the next slide that how I ended up with having like different ranges and so on with different vegetation type. I had to define what they mean in terms of the literature and so on, and match the information. And finally, what I got, if I go here, sorry. So, and finally, I was able basically to define a carbon sequestration rate for each vegetation type. So there are several factors here. We looked at the soil, we looked at the vegetation type, we looked at the current grazing and current degradation level, and we looked at the potential of the land for carbon sequestration. So when productivity improves from point A to point B, how much it would be in the biomass, in forage, in above ground biomass, and how much would be in the soil. We got those information also from the literature, and we came with a range. And so we used that range to do the calculation, as you can see here. Okay, I have done a lot of modeling and measurements of the carbon in grasslands, in Switzerland, in Canada, and in Iran, basically. And I know that in Canada, in the same conditions, you can get half a ton or even more per year. Here in Mongolia, because of the vegetation condition and so on, it would be much less. The numbers that came out from the that collaboration between the Mongolian Rangeland Management Society and the University from the UK, those numbers shows around 12 to 15, and for some site around 0.3 ton per hectare, basically. I would carefully look at the literature, basically, to get these numbers. And I think these numbers are not too bad. But again, I have the minimum and maximum. And I'm pretty sure that the numbers would be somewhere here. We don't have the measurements, but we have the literature, and we think that the number is somewhere there. Now, someone wants to say 34, someone wants to say 15. It's a large range, definitely. But the actual number is somewhere there. So that's what I was trying to do. I always hate to be absolute about something when I do the calculation estimations. And so this is the uncertainty range. But if you put all of this together, then the amount of the carbon sequestration, those are the number that you can see there, basically. So those realistic range of carbon sequestration from literature are important. That's the factor-based approach that we talk. That's the practice. At the beginning, we talked like the tier 1 greenhouse gas emission factor. We are at that level, but we want to move from that level to the other level. This is another example from putting both vegetation and soil, of course, together. And down here, I have the ranges for vegetation and the ranges for the soil. Of course, for the vegetation, you can't expect something more than 22 to kilogram per hectare carbon, which is about 50 kilogram, around 50 kilogram of biomass over a short period. But for the carbon in the soil, you can have a higher number. When you put this together, of course, most of this would be on the soil, based on the area of this vegetation type. And vegetation type have different capacity, not just because of their area, but also because of their characteristics and degradation level. But you can earn something, you can protect a lot of carbon, you can put a lot of carbon, and that carbon is significant. That's what I wanted to demonstrate here. If someone wants to do really assessment for developing a market or offset program, that would be a different story, which is on my next slide. Any questions so far? Do you think that this number, have you ever had any chance to calculate any of this number? Do you think that these numbers make sense or not?
This maximum and minimum given, so I will look forward to little explore more after you send.
Sure.
See the numbers of it.
Yeah, and again, like this is a lot of expert opinion involved with this, basically. So it's not really concrete measurement. So yeah, have to. I have to sleep tonight for more than 5 hours or 6 hours. Excuse me. Okay. So let's go to Mongolia again. And this is really, I want to get your opinion, basically. We are in the process of developing the same system for Canada. And that's with the Canadian Grassland and Forage Association, basically. And I wanted to put the general things that we have here for the carbon. Basically, it takes a year, definitely, if we want to detect changes. Basically, sometimes you start an experiment or new management, and then 4 or 6 years, you see nothing, and suddenly you see the jump increase. So a lot of funding that comes usually is short, and then you have to do something, basically. But there is a way, basically, is definitely you can go combine approaches, you can go with the model supported by measurement. But how do you want to do that? You need a network of monitoring programs. And that network of monitoring programs should be selected in a way that can cover all different environmental, ecological, and management condition, basically. Because you want to develop a model, you want to treat all the carbon credit provider equally. You can't have a different measurement for one province than the other province. You want to be consistent, but you also want to be science-based. So that network is definitely critical. Then what does the network? What is the role of the network? Collect. Collect means a lot. You need a standard protocol. For those of you that are familiar with the carbon assessment and measurements, we know that we have Australian protocols. We have VCS protocols. We have FAO now has a protocol for measurements. And sometimes when you talk to a soil scientist, you say, I want to measure carbon. The first question you get, how deep? And then you say 1 meter. Second question, okay, which carbon? Okay, organic carbon. Which type of organic carbon? Okay, carbon, dead carbon. Okay, which kind of dead organic carbon? And so, look, you get a lot of questions and say, okay, I forgot, I don't want to do any carbon assessment. So you have to take the science to a practical monitoring network, basically. And so collecting means a lot of discussions, a lot of networking, and that's what we are doing right now, developing a roadmap for Canada. Management of the data is a big issue always. A lot of people who collect the data, they don't have the capacity basically with data management, or what we call it metadata. If you collect information, you need to attach all the information to that data that everyone can use it. And it has to be publicly available. Share data set. The concept of open data concept is so important, basically. Nothing is here to hide, basically. It's for the good of the country. And so you just do all the information. The most difficult part is the management practice. And that's where the data privacy comes into the place. That's where you go to one herder, he says, I don't want to say how many animals I have. I don't want to say how I graze the land. And so you get to these difficulties. I'm living in a developed country. My monitoring program is in place for the last 15 years. There's a corner in our province that they never, ever let us to do any monitoring there. But we can't do anything, basically. But we have farmers that they open their door, okay, come and do and collect whatever you want. And we have farmers that they say, okay, come and collect, but do not share with the public. So, and that's where the network can handle all of this situation, basically. Okay, at the end of the day, you have a network, you monitor over the time, you update your model over the time, and then you make sure that you have a verified and validated system for providing credit or for carbon credit. I think if Mongolia wants to do something good with these big projects that are coming and so on, they have done with the monitoring, photo monitoring and so on. If they want to do something that in future, by 5, 7, 8 years, they have a successful market, that's the key. The monitoring piece is the key. Who is taking care of that? Land agency, pasture user groups, Society of Range Management. I don't know. That's the part that I really don't know. But what I know is that we have done a lot of work with the producers and a lot of work with the scientists and also with the government institutions to come with this framework for Canada to do this network of monitoring network and how to develop network and so on. Of course, there are much more details. Unfortunately, I can't share some of those details because it's still under this discussion. But anyway, so I tried to walk you through what does carbon stock mean? What does carbon stock change mean? And how carbon stock is different than carbon sequestration, basically. And then how many different type of carbon stocks we have or carbon pool we have. And then I try to explain you the existing approach very quickly. Every of those has very detailed, like empirical, factor-based, hybrid, modeling measurements. And they try to basically catch up with some of the concepts related to business as usual and fixed baseline and what does carbon stock means. And then presenting the buy to consume examples that if you have no information or you are in a data scarce country, but still you want to do something to demonstrate, maybe there is a still way and there are information in the country that can be used. If I would have had access to more information, specifically the English information, I would probably do a better job. But that was the maximum that I could do. And then my final slides about the monitoring program and so on. So I hope that was somehow interesting for you. And it was not too boring for some of you, because I know that the workshop would be different, definitely, than a presentation. Thank you. How much time? Yeah. Oh, we have still half an hour left. No, I'm happy to answer any questions. And specifically, it's not about the question; it's about the feedback. Okay, we also want to develop our skill, and we also want to be criticized, and we also want to learn from you. If there is anything that you feel that, oh yeah, you're here only for 3 times, and now you're talking about this and that, definitely that's not my intention to disrespect anyone, any scientist or anyone in this country. I'm just bringing the experience that I have from the other places, basically, that hopefully there are some learning here. But I'm happy to answer any question if there's any. We call it open discussion time. Really? No.
How you start knowing more information, you just get quieter.
Right.
We will have those situations in the future. As long as you don't know the whole aspect of the carbon sequestration or carbon stocks, that people will just more introvert. It's really quieter because you don't know the whole aspect. In my case, I think we needed to really speak out and do whatever we can, because we cannot really outrun you, or at least come near your level. So, yeah. But thank you so much. It's just the one word, bombastic. You will be right. Yeah.
Thank you. And we always have, like in our monitoring program, we always say that we measure what we value. So basically, like right now, carbon is not valued much, so we don't measure it. But one day, maybe there is a market and everyone is after carbon measurements. So Mongolia, if they want to create the opportunity, they can do it right now. They can do it fast. And then they can say, we have the best data and we have verifications and everything in place. Come and buy it, basically. That would be definitely great. But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's so useful. And I want to ask, there's a lot of protocols for measuring.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think in Mongolia we need separate protocol, or we can use some, common protocol for carbon credit?
Yeah, great question. And that we had the same discussions in Canada, basically. Like the Australian protocol came in, VCS, FAO, and everything, basically. But there are 2 sides of the protocol. One side is about scientific part, what to measure and how to measure. That part you can easily take and you can adapt to your soil and climate condition, basically. That's not really difficult because there's a lot of information already there. You may get to the question that, okay, how deep I want to measure the carbon in protocol, Australian protocol is maybe 50 centimeter. Then you say, here, maybe I have only 30 centimeter of the soil. So those are quick fix. But what is more important in the protocol is that to adopt the protocol to socio-economic conditions that you have in your country. And that's a difficult part. If you take from Australian protocol, they have different sort of the grazings and they have different sort of land management than you do in Mongolia. So that part you need to develop. But the good news is that a lot of this work has been done and a lot of example is available these days. At the end of the day, you don't want to rush, but you want to make sure that if you start with any program, you don't have to change it after 6 months or so. That's why the Canadian government has developed what we call it living labs. We have a network of living labs across Canada. And the government of Canada has spent the last 3-4 years about 300 million, and then last year spent 600 million. 2 weeks ago, they announced another 200 million. The reason is that we are testing all of these in different parts of the country with different management practices, with different soil, with different climate, with different group of herders and producers, with different social aspects. That gives us the background basically to make sure that if we start to develop the market or verification, then this is something that is working for the entire country. And sometimes you see that I'm involved with one of the living lab. There are about 300 producers, beef producers, ranchers are involved with that. Basically, we work in their land. And these 300 people contribute to all this discussion for measurements and so on, and how they want to do it and how they want to address their management practices. So this is where you need university support. We do a lot of consultation. I go from practical side. A lot of people come from the pure science. A lot of people come from the producer side and end user side. And it is a lot of discussions. But because there are already a lot of experiences in the other corner of the world, I think you can definitely get a lot of good information out of that. Definitely, you don't want to create something for Gobi Desert that does not work for the northern part of the country. That's something that you need to do. Yeah, maybe Australian protocol does not have all of those different conditions that you have here. So you need to adopt for sure.
Yeah, that was my second question. From your perspective, how many possible models or protocols do you see in Mongolia? Different ecological ecosystems.
Mongolia is different than Canada, of course. Mongolia is probably more similar to what we have in Iran. We have like area like Gobi Desert, and then we have mountain pastures, and then we have forests, basically. So most probably what you need is to look at these main bioclimate region in Mongolia, and then make your develop like a protocol based on that, basically. In the Gobi Desert, you don't need to go to 0.5 meter because a lot of the carbon probably is just 0 to 20. And you have a different sort of vegetation, basically, and measurements would be different than in Dornot and in areas that you have high productivity, basically. So bioclimatic region would be definitely what you want to put the base on. But you have to make sure that whatever you develop for the Mongolia, because if you want to put it in the context of carbon market, it has to be equal. It's exactly the same concept of CO2 equivalent. You have to make sure that you can put it in the market that is applicable basically across the country. But the way that you measure might be slightly different. I think most of the difficulties for you guys to develop this kind of protocol would be to find enough measurements from different parts of the country that gives you an idea of what would be the best approach to go for. And I believe that there are scientists that they already have how they want to share the data and so on. I don't know. Like in Canada, we collected most of the information, most of the data that is available, basically, and we went through all of those information to get an idea that what would be the ideal situation in terms of the sampling, frequency of sampling, intensity of sampling, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I don't have a concrete answer for you. I still need to understand more about the socio-economic aspect of the Mongolia before I say, no, this is the best approach.
Yeah, thank you, Majid, for your 2-3 presentation, right? It's really interesting, actually. Yeah, we don't have much to start. We don't have any monitoring, but somewhere we have to start, right? Sometimes somewhere we have to start, but we have very good soil map from for Mongolian.
Yeah, I have seen that with the Russian. Yes.
And that's actually a very good one. And then I just, maybe we should start from there and then choose and we have, usually we have 5 climate zones, some zone, and then, so basically 5 climate zones, and we have different soil types, each zone, similar. So it's like quite a big matrix we have to do, which means we have to have monitoring. That's what it is. And then once we define carbon stock, we need to define carbon stock change by monitoring, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we have very, very severe drought. Sometimes we have like very nice year, sometimes very, very good summer, something like that. Anyways, so we have to start. I just wish there is some policymaker sitting here, or you can deliver, you can endorse your output from this project. You know, you endorse some information to the Ministry of Environment and Tourism or something, like, you know, let them know that we need this kind of monitoring system to do something about the carbon stock change, so we can use later on. Of course, it's like government say, okay, is it useful for tomorrow or next year or the year after? No, it's not. It's at least 2 years, then 4 years, maybe 5, 6 is the optimal years when you're able to say, okay, this kind of changes is occurring. At least like maybe 6 years. I don't know, 5 years is good. You know, манайх ч нөгөө 4 жилээр cycle явагдчихсан. Заримдаа 100-д болдог жил 4 жилээр болдог шүү дээ. 4 жилийн дараа л бид нар only after 4 years, for example, we in Mongolia we always say every 4 years zud occurs or something like that. Every 4 years winter. So it's some cycle going on. We know that. We have very good research on that. So maybe 4 years is maybe after 4 years, which means 5 years is best. So those kind of endorsement later, you know, stating that we need this one. And then I was in the training lately, maybe 2 weeks ago, with FAO, and they said your government has to express the interest to start this kind of monitoring.
Yeah.
So if this project can do some kind of endorsement, deliver some endorsement letter to government, that would be nice.
Yeah.
What else? About the management part, we do have very traditional, which means very elderly herdsmen. They use very traditional method of herding, pasture using. But I heard that there is survey saying that young herders, they changed it completely. For their method, it's almost like what is it called? Farmers kind of method. So
yeah, they don't make the cow twice.
Yeah, not much questions I have. I just have this kind of like concerns, kind of. Okay.
Yeah,
thank
I,
you.
I think these are great points. If I was probably leading Mongolia now in terms of the carbon, I would just start quickly, even without any data, setting up a good model for each of these bioclimatic regions. And so the concepts are in the models. You don't have data to validate and calibrate. But what the model can give you is basically, we call it in a project, we call it phase 1 or phase 0, even not 1. The model gives you where the informations are wrong or too far from the reality and where you need the data. And then you can just go and collect informations and so on. And a good thing with starting something is that you learn from your mistake, and also you bring the hidden data, basically, the data that's sitting in the gray literature. Let's say you set up a model for Gobi Desert, and then you present it, you go and present, and then suddenly people come and say, oh, we have measured, this is different. This is not like this. Okay, thank you for coming. Just give me your data. I want to learn from you. And we have done this for a few things in Alberta, for example. I have done this, and then I was presenting, and then someone says, oh, I have better data. And I said, well, you have the better data. I don't have it. Give it to me, and I give you better data. So sometimes you just have to start from somewhere, and just then people start to jump in. I have met people here in Mongolia that showed me database of carbon data and so on, and a lot of different things, basically. But they don't want to share. Of course, this is their data. This is their business, basically, right? But if you start to put something and they say, okay, I have a model now, the government wants to use it. They said, oh, we also have. Wait, we also have. And then you can discover about the data. I'm pretty sure that there is a lot of data still available. Your soil map is a great map. I have seen that map. It's very detailed, actually. What is missing, really, something to take out of this photo monitoring program and out of this range and health program. The locations are good, okay? But you need to bring it to the spatial scale. You need to go from the point to polygon, basically. And that needs some modeling effort, that needs some some working on some of the data that is collected, use data that is collected, creating some degradation map, some detail map, looking at some course management. So you have to start from somewhere. You should not be afraid that, okay, I don't have money and I can't develop a monitoring program. And that's basically the university should jump in. University should have, I'm actually surprised that why there is no complete hydrological model for Mongolia. Hydrology model, because you have water gauge station data, you can set up a hydrological model and you can improve it over time. And it's quite helpful for climate change, water quality management, and so on at basin, sub-basin level. The same for carbon. You can start from somewhere, setting up the model. Don't think that the people that are doing now in Mongolia and so on are doing the magic things. They also measured some stuff and they also run a model, somehow calibrated, and now they're selling the carbon credit, basically. So you just have to start from somewhere. And I call it phase 0. When I was in Switzerland in 2007, someone from government of Alberta called us and said, we want to do a hydrological modeling, basically. Then we did a phase 0. And then after that, they asked us to write a proposal. We got 1.5 million to do a detailed hydrological modeling, basically. So, yeah, people, they start to look at the literature.
Just one more thing, I was thought about it. You have these tables for Mongolian, especially pine tumen. You have 4 soil types and everything. And I will compare that numbers, the during JICA project, we got some measurements like from Gobi Desert to Semi Desert, and then kind of like strip, how I call it, like it's gone through like from south to north.
Okay, gradients, basically.
Something like very, very like narrow.
Okay.
But unfortunately, we try to transect.
Yeah.
We try to move the other side, the COVID status, so the JICA and other universities couldn't do that. So I will compare the numbers from reviewers. I can compare those with those actual numbers and
Okay.
okay.
Just don't make it public, okay? I can buy.
Until we make sure it's.
Yeah. If those numbers are not good, I can buy for you a copy. Just don't put it in this pool. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, that's how it is. Exactly. That's my point. Put something on the table. Look for the people to come and challenge you and bring your new data. Yeah. And then you bring new data, and this is how you discover the data. That's how it is. Start from somewhere. We don't have gun in Canada as US. Sure. Sure, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, one short question. Can you share this literature from the Mongolian Society for Range Management in cooperation with England, something? Report or
this report?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The report, Excel file, all of the paper that I looked, everything. I can put it in a Google Drive and they can share it with you. No problem.
Thank you.
And anytime you have a question, let me know. I would be happy when I get back home to Canada to hear that something useful came out of this, basically. And I have no intention for business or anything else. Just.
Well, maybe some PhD students.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Definitely. Yeah. That would be the interesting part.
Баярлалаа. За би монголоор асууж орчуулагдсан. Би ч одоо нэг хагас ойлгоод байгаа юм уу тэгээд суугаад байгаа. Би яг хувийн хвшлийг төлөөлж оролцож байгаа. Ягаад тэгэхээр бид нар бол энэ хагас бэлчээрийн хагас фермийн аж ахуй хөгжүүлэхийг сонирхож байгаа улсууд. Тэгэхээр энэ дээр нэг ганц нэг асуултууд байна. Тэр маллаас гарч байгаа ялгцыг одоо тэр энэ үс төрөгчийн ялгарлыг одоо контроллох эсвэл тэрийн яг тал дээр нэг юм яриад авчих юм. Тэгэхээр бид нар бол яг нэг ийм юм хөгжүүлж байгаа. Түрүүний микробиом гэж яриад байгаа шүү дээ. Микроэлементүүд дэрэг дагалдах бус ферментүүд дээр нэг тийм төрлийн юм дээр судалгаа хийж байгаа. Ягаад тэгэхээр нөгөө фермийн аж ахуйнууд маш өнгийн үүдэг, өвлийн цагт яг битүү багт бол одоо ч аюултай байдаг. Тэр нөгөө нэг Америк үнэртдэг, юун үнэртдэг. Яг нь энэ тал дээр ажиллаад бид яг нэг юм концентрат дээр ажиллаж байгаа. Ер нь одоо мэрэгжлийн үнэ Канадад юм уу хамаагүй дэлхий дээр ер нь хааны газар яг энэ мал амьтанд энэ микробиомыг ууж хэрэглэхээр эсвэл ялгцсанд нь цацаж хүрсгээр хэрэгжилж исэн тийм туршлага харсан уу өөрөө биечлэн?
Well, I hope I understood the question well, but there are a lot of studies right now about beneficial bacteria, what we call it beneficial bacteria, basically. And beneficial bacteria are the one that we want to promote in the soil because they are the one that they help with the process, but they don't let the carbon or to be released basically in any form basically. And I know that there are studies around using beneficial bacteria on manure storage and specifically with the feedlot to decrease amount of nitrous oxide and greenhouse gas emission. This is not exactly my expertise, but I know a lot of private sector companies basically are after these beneficial bacteria basically. Manure management in any form, from the feedlot, storage, even when you put the manure in the field, a lot of private sector companies, they want to take the manure, use basically beneficial bacteria to decompose in a way that is not that nutrient is released and use it as biofertilizer, basically. So there are research. It's not my field. I don't work in that area, basically. But I know that there are works coming in Canada in any form, like manure management, with any sort of experiment that they can decrease harmful bacteria and increase beneficial bacteria. That has been a technology, basically, that I would say a lot of private sectors are after business out of this. And the reason is that they can sell it, commercialize it as a fertilizer or as a new type of, how do you say, healthy, more like biofertilizer, maybe something like that. So, but that's not really my field exactly. I can't really answer that. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Is asking about microbial agents for bioremediation.
Oh, for bioremediation. Okay, I see that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Microbial agents.
Yeah. Okay. That's not really. It's not my field. Basically, I know that the research in this area. I mean that the University of Alberta, we have a lab looking at this stuff. But most of the things that we do is about heavy metal, and because we have oil and gas industry and it has huge impact on the environment, a lot of things is related to that. But honestly, I don't know much about that. I don't want to give you wrong information. But you have my email address and I can give you my card. If you send me your question, I can find good information for you or connect you to someone who is expert in that. That I can do, and I promise. You know, I talk too much about everything, but I'm not expert in it, in anything, basically. More questions? And these are like very interesting topics, basically, bacterial communities and microbes. Someone contacted me. I have a friend who is very traditional in Switzerland, and he had an old friend from Italy who invented a formula for a biofertilizer. But then the Italian guy unfortunately passed away, and his wife gave all the information to my Swiss friend. And then the formula for biofertilizer or something like that has two components. Has a microbial component and has a non-microbial component. The non-microbial component is the secret. The microbial component is not a secret. They are microbial bacteria or microbial species that they can use in this kind of fertilizer and so on. But when they wanted to import it to Canada, Canada has a Fertilizer Act. And the Fertilizer Act does not let you to bring anything to Canada. You have to be very careful what you bring and so on. So he asked me, okay, can you go and collect soil information and identify beneficial bacteria and give it to me? And I said, I'm sorry. If we knew that, then so he was not able to make a business in Canada anyway. It was target for a small garden, vegetable and production and so on, and could be very good basically because he does great in Switzerland, and I have been in his home, and he does great stuff basically. No irrigation at all basically, and he's doing great, and I believe his stuff, but we were not able to bring it to Canada. So that's the key. That you see that 3 years ago, 5 years ago, all the research about the soil health was around carbon. But now everything is shifting, microbiome. And they go with the eDNA and with the genetic, because with the eDNA connection, now you can say who is in the zoo, how many species you have there. And now all the research is going around the beneficial bacteria, fungi, to find out what is happening in the soil that we can't really just go back to the healthy soil. So that's a very interesting area. And that's the part that is totally missing from any ecosystem models, any carbon models so far. None of the models that we have the microbial component. They do have some sort of equation behind the scene, but that's the least developed part of the modeling in terms of the carbon. But great point. I will learn something through the literature later.
Маш сонирхолтой хэвчүүлсэн мажита баяр хүрч байдаг.